Chapter 1003. The regal magnificent royal place stood tall in the holy capital of the great Zhou sacred dynasty. Sunlight shone on the ancient buildings, casting holy golden glimmer throughout the place. The place was vast, regal and solemn. The palace of the sacred king stood tall above the steps. That was where the Zhou sacred king, sovereign of the great Zhou sacred dynasty, trained. The regal magnificent royal place stood tall in the holy capital of the great Zhou sacred dynasty. Sunlight shone on the ancient buildings, casting holy golden glimmer throughout the place. The place was vast, regal and solemn. The palace of the sacred king stood tall above the steps. That was where the Zhou sacred king, sovereign of the great Zhou sacred dynasty, trained. There were seraglios at the back of that palace. Things were getting rather exciting on the bed within the lapis lazuli palace. The sacred king was inside the palace and a white jade-like body was coiled around him like a water snake. Her alluring appearance, supple skin, and a pair of enticing eyes made her a fine specimen that few women could compare with. Few like her existed throughout the entire eastern state, yet she was seen giving her all to serve the figure on the bed. "Am I not pretty?" a light, enticing voice said. The sacred king looked at her calmly and his hands caressed her supple skin, as if he would have been able to squeeze the life out of her. "So you want another go then?" the sacred king said plainly. "It would be my honor, your majesty." Her eyes were foxy and alluring. "Well then, I shall indulge you one last time," the sacred king said plainly, and C looked puzzled. The king then turned around, looking at C as if he was looking at the glass saint. C ceased thinking as she descended into pleasurable frenzy with the sacred king. The sacred king walked out of the bedchambers after a while. C remained lying quietly on the bed. A thin blanket covered her body. Her beautiful eyes were shut forever, and she would never awaken from her slumber again. The sacred king came to the steps leading to the palace. He stood at the top of the steps and gazed upon the sacred king palace. Magnificent buildings stood tall within the vast vicinity of the royal palace, looking regal and solemn. The place had once been the most powerful seat in the entire eastern state. The great Zhou sacred dynasty had once ruled all over the eastern state. Zhou Jiming gained renown at a young age and displayed unparalleled talents, getting titled as crown prince very young. He had an ambition of bringing a renaissance to the great Zhou sacred dynasty, uniting the entire eastern state under one rule again. He was born as a leading figure of the 9 states. He was bold and unrestrained. No one was able to stand in his way if he intended to get something done. No one was able to escape if he intended to kill them. However, there was a woman that he intended to get his hands on, and he had never gotten her. Furthermore, the sacred dynasty suffered considerably due to that woman. His father perished and his own path to sainthood had once been blocked by that woman. He met obstacles for the first time at the hands of the glass saint, letting him know that he, Zhou Jiming, had things that he was unable to get done and women that he was unable to get his hands on. As such, the glass saint became an obsession of his. He then encountered yet another person, Yi Futian, a sage who had once been little more than an ant before him and who dared to defy his wishes. That sage even ordered to kill the mighty ones of the great Zhou sacred dynasty right before him. The sacred king once thought that the ant of a person would have been plunged into regret for his life so long as the sacred king gave the order. The sacred war broke out and the sacred king's forces went out to destroy the holy Ji palace. However, the first battle of the sacred war failed. They lost. The first loss suffered by the sacred dynasty led to the string of events that followed. The holy Ji palace grew in power in the following sacred war battles. The sage, who had been like an ant before him, someone that he would have never even batted an eye for, came to become a threat to him and a threat to the great Zhou sacred dynasty. All of that sounded pathetically laughable, yet it was how things truly went. 2 figures were seen at the sacred king's side. They were none other than the other saint of the sacred dynasty, Zhou Yanwang, and brother of the sacred king, Zhou Mian. The 3 were currently the most powerful figures to be found in the sacred dynasty, both in terms of status and actual combat prowess. Yi Futian brought only the swordsman of the holy Ji palace then? The sacred king asked. Indeed. Zhou Yanwang nodded and continued. All the others went to Xihua Sacred Mountain. The forces of the holy Ji palace did not bother to cover their tracks. So he's trying to take on the sages of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty all on his own then? The sacred king said coldly. It had been a year since the last battle and Yi Futian had grown stronger. However, the palace lord remained just as unrestrained and boisterous, bringing only the swordsmen of the Holy Ji Palace to attack the Great Zhou sacred dynasty. It is extremely possible that the girl named Yaya is a reincarnation of the Sword Saint of the Void. Would you like to avoid them for the moment, Sacred King? Zhou Mian advised. Both the Sacred King and Zhou Yanwang still had the option to flee. The Sacred King did not reply to Zhou Mian's words. His eyes remained looking forward. There are many holy lands throughout the 9 states and there are many saints as well. The saints of the Holy Ji Palace could flee, the Glass Saint could flee, but not me, Zhou Jiming. Intense pride and arrogance were seen within the Sacred King's eyes as he continued. I'm the Sacred King of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty. Everyone within the sacred dynasty can flee, but not me, Zhou Jiming. The Great Zhou sacred dynasty stood tall in the eastern state for many years, and had once reigned supreme throughout the eastern state. The Glass Saint was able to disband the Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple and flee, but it was not an option for him. A disbanded sacred dynasty could have no longer been called a sacred dynasty after all. Yi Futian came for the Great Zhou sacred dynasty that day. If he were to run, the Zhou sacred king would be rendered a pathetic loser. There were only 2 saints coming for him at the moment. There was no way that he, the sacred king fighting with the home advantage, could have just run without a fight. Relay my orders. All personnel of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty are to head to their stations and prepare for battle, the sacred king said in a powerful voice, which resounded throughout the entire royal palace. Countless shook violently upon hearing his orders. So the battle is on then? Many thought. You all have only one mission in the upcoming battle, and that is to kill Yi Futian, the sacred king said coldly with intense killing intent burning in his eyes. If the assassins were unable to get the job done, then the people of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty would be the ones to end him. If they proved incapable of doing so, then the sacred king himself would finish the job. Even if he happened to fail, then there were still Zhouye, Zhouyu, and the others who had begun their journey of leaving the 9 states. They were to leave the 9 states, the lands under the rule of Emperor Xia. If the Great Zhou sacred dynasty were to perish, then Zhouye and the others would kill Yi Futian by borrowing the powers of others from Emperor Li's realm. Yi Futian needed to die regardless of the cost. Yi Futian should have felt proud for being able to make Zhou Jiming make such decisions. The wind blew and the golden robes on the sacred king billowed. The golden dragon's image on the robe looked as if it was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws, looking overbearing and unrestrained, just like how the sacred king was at the moment. Yi Futian of the Holy Ji Palace was able to face the allied forces of 7 holy lands and stand his ground. He would have ended up dead if he had lost. If Zhou Jiming were to run, it would have made him, the sacred king of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty, someone beneath Yi Futian. He wanted to see if Yi Futian would be able to leave the royal palace of the sacred dynasty alive. Get into formation. I shall see if the return of the Sword Saint of the Void will be able to break the great matrix of the sacred dynasty, the sacred king said with a cold, aloof voice. One figure after another flashed about within the royal palace, taking their stations and preparing for a fight. All sages were getting ready to fight. The aura of the sheer number of people getting ready for battle shot to the sky. The battle over a year ago had him sending only the elite Golden Phoenix battle matrix due to being harassed by the ones from the Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple. As a result, he suffered the least losses among the participating forces, and he still possessed extremely powerful armies under his command. Will Yi Futian be able to kill them all with just a bunch of swordsmen? A sword flew by above the Great Zhou sacred dynasty's holy capital, drawing streaks that emanated terrifying sword will in the air. The speed of the sword was incredibly fast as they zipped by in the air, heading all the way into the holy capital. Countless watched with their hearts racing. Who is here? The sword seemed to be heading towards the royal palace. Yaya the village chief, Yi Futian, Qinzhuang, and others stood on the sword as it zipped past the air. Fierce winds beat on their bodies, rustling their clothes and making them sound as if they were howling. Yi Futian kept his eyes forward. A group of people appeared from another direction. The Glass Saints with her group of mighty ones from the Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple. Yi Futian and the glass saint exchanged looks and turned their eyes forward again, heading straight for their shared destination. They arrived the royal palace shortly, with their eyes on the very ancient royal palace of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty. Extremely dazzling golden screens of light shrouded the space at the moment, turning into an incredibly huge shadow of the phoenix. It was none other than the great matrix of the sacred dynasty. The sacred king stood before the hall of the royal palace, looking up at them. Glass saint. The sacred king looked at the glass saint with cold eyes. She had actually come for his head with Yi Futian. Zhou Jiming. The glass saint's hair billowed and the love destroyer appeared in her hand. The sword was as cold as frost as it emanated strong killing intent. Yaya moved forward and appeared above the matrix with the village chief right behind her. The sacred king looked at Yaya and thought that all the ruckus now started with that one order that he gave all those years ago, to kill the girl's parents. Yaya too looked at the sacred king. Her eyes were filled with cold killing intent as well. Her eyes then turned extremely demonic. It was as if a bloody sword appeared in the air and swept up the place with thick sword will. A storm of sword aura whipped up with Yaya at the center. She looked up at the sky for a bit. There seemed to be a bloody sword within her blood-colored eyes. A bloody eye appeared in the sky. Boundless sword will from their surroundings coursed rapidly within that instant, gathering around her body and growing in strength. A sword diagram appeared in the air, devouring sword aura from all directions. The storm grew increasingly intense, sweeping about the place as it headed straight for the holy capital. Some people far away felt the swords in their hands ringing, before shooting skyward. The sword matrix of the void, huh? The sacred king shot a cold look at Yaya. She actually came to be able to use the sword matrix of the void. Broom. A huge rumble was heard in the air. The sacred king took control of the great matrix and a humongous pair of golden wings shot out, splitting the air before them and headed straight for Yaya. Yaya's hair billowed as she continued to gain altitude. Storms of greater magnitude were whipped up. An enormous matrix diagram of the void appeared above the holy capital. The incoming wings were torn to shreds right away. Yaya stayed floating in the air and stood before the sword diagram. It was as if she had turned into the eye of the sword herself, merging with the sword diagram. Her eyes turned blood red. Towering light of the sword pulsed and boundless aura swept about the place. Kill. Yaya uttered a word coldly. The sword diagram in the air turned into a single sword as soon as she finished. She swooped down. The sword that tore through the space before it clashed with the matrix below. Countless cracks appeared on the matrix that protected the sacred dynasty within an instant. It crumbled altogether soon after. The glass saint and the village chief stepped forward at the same time. The glass saint walked towards the sacred king, while the village chief walked towards Zhou Yanwang. Yi Futian walked forward. Qin Zhuang, Yi Wuchen and the others followed right behind him, entering the royal palace of the sacred dynasty. They were not moving at high speeds as they simply took one step after another forward. The sacred king stood unflinchingly. He took a look and wondered if that was the sword matrix of the void. Even if Yaya was still incapable of bringing the complete matrix to bear, its powers remained undeniably frightening. One hit was all it took to break the great matrix that had been protecting the Great Zhou sacred dynasty for over 1,000 years. Zhou Jiming. A voice was heard. The sacred king lowered his head and looked at Yi Futian, who was walking into the royal palace. The young sage had no fear as he walked straight into the midst of the mighty ones waiting to fight him, as if none of the mighty ones of the sacred dynasty existed. There shall no longer be a Great Zhou sacred dynasty in the 9 states from this day forth. The halberd of time and space appeared in his hand, as he stepped into the midst of the army of mighty ones ready to take him on. Chapter 1004. Yi Futian stepped into the air, and the halberd of time and space devoured all the brilliant light. With every step, an invisible airflow swept through the palace. A great wind rose up around him, and the faint sound of it whistling through the air could be heard. His white hair blew in the wind as the dangerous airflow filled the sky. At this moment the space around him was completely still and silent. Yi Futian stepped into the air, and the halberd of time and space devoured all the brilliant light. With every step, an invisible airflow swept through the palace. A great wind rose up around him, and the faint sound of it whistling through the air could be heard. His white hair blew in the wind as the dangerous airflow filled the sky. At this moment, the space around him was completely still and silent. Outside the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty Palace, a group of figures in the air watched the airflow inside and their hearts were troubled. Today, Yi Futian had led the cultivators of the Holy Ji Palace on an attack against the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. There were 3 saints and a group of sword cultivators. With such a small group, they had broken through to the inner palace. The young woman had summoned the sword matrix of all heavens, and had destroyed the matrix of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty Palace with a single sword. This was truly the craziest thing to happen in the history of the 9 states. This palace had once controlled the vast eastern state. And now the barren state, which had once been so weak that anyone could bully it, had been able to break into this holy palace with so few people under Yi Futian's leadership. Even 8 years ago, no one would have believed it to be possible. Set up the matrix, came a voice. The Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty's 2 great figures of the sage ranking, Zhou Mian and Ye Gai, led the army to form a matrix. They surrounded Yi Futian in an arc. At the front was the Golden Phoenix Battle Matrix, led by Zhou Mian, the most powerful battle matrix of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. Today, they had gathered all the noble-blooded cultivators of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty into this matrix in order to kill Yi Futian. But somehow Yi Futian still continued forward. Every single one of the battle matrices felt a strong sense of threat from him. This one man seemed like he could cut his way through an entire army. Perhaps it was because the shock they had felt from Yi Futian's last couple battles was too strong. It left an unshakable image in their minds. Outside of those on the Saint Plain, he had no rivals in the 9 states. He could destroy an army all on his own. On that day at the palace, imperial brilliance had shone upon him, and many cultivators had turned to ash. But this time Yi Futian did not release that kind of power. So they still had a chance to kill him. Yi Futian advanced towards the Golden Phoenix Battle Matrix, and everyone's life spirit bloomed. Their golden phoenixes cried out as their endless power melded together, giving birth to a single golden bird that covered the skies. It screamed at Yi Futian, and a terrible airflow swept out towards him, turning into a destructive golden flame that glowed with sharp golden light. But Yi Futian seemed not to feel it. He continued forward, as the swordsmen behind him just watched. They had no intention of getting involved. It seemed like Yi Futian could handle this battle on his own. They had just come for the hunt. They would let none of them escape. The violent attack swept out towards Yi Futian, who was standing by himself. Suddenly, a destructive force appeared in the air above him, and cracking sounds rang out into the distance as apocalyptic golden thunder crashed. The world around him was transformed into a purgatory of destruction. The violent airflow shot towards him but was swallowed up by the destructive force. Yi Futian rose up slowly higher and higher just like a god. The destructive storm swept out, covering the sky, seeming to want to cover the entirety of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty Palace. Every bit of destructive light in the storm contained within it the power to tear through space. Within the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty, countless people looked up at Yi Futian where he floated in the sky like a god. The Great Zhou Sacred King was also watching, but he did not immediately attack. When he sensed Yi Futian's power, a strong desire to kill flashed in his eyes. Yi Futian stepped forward and turned into a dazzling golden beam of light. He flashed through the sky towards the matrix where Zhou Mian was. He thrust the halberd of time and space forward and a blinding radiance ran through the air, swallowing up all the light. Zhou Mian moved, and the Golden Phoenix Battle Matrix released a powerful aura. Its huge wings trembled as the huge phoenix gathered together, the power of all the nobles of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty into a single attack. It turned into a devastating divine phoenix and rushed towards Yi Futian. Countless golden figures appeared in the sky and streamed towards Yi Futian. But he ignored them all and pierced through the golden phoenix. The halberd of time and space swallowed up all the light. His arms shook as the halberd shot forward. The halberd of time and space brought nothingness. Everything turned into nothingness. A dull sound rose up from the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty Palace rose up, and a terrible glow shot out. The halberd of time and space collided with the golden phoenix, and all the people below could see was a radiant glimmer. Boom! There was a sound that shook the heavens and the earth as the Golden Phoenix Battle Matrix shattered and the cultivators within flew in different directions, spitting up blood. A single attack from his halberd had destroyed the Golden Phoenix battle matrix. Outside the palace, people could faintly see the destructive light. They trembled as the halberd descended, and the Golden Phoenix battle matrix was destroyed. Their hearts seemed to want to jump out of their chests. Was this the legendary Futian from the Barren State? White hair and white clothes, and with a single thrust of the halberd could shock gods and ghosts. Besides the saints, who could match him? He was, without a doubt, the most powerful figure in the 9 states below the saint level. The destructive light swept out from Futian, swallowing up every bolt of lightning in the sky. A group of figures fell down to the earth, their spiritual will having collapsed. At that moment everyone knew true despair. The destructive light enveloped Zhou Mian. It raged across his body, making him tremble. Futian floated over towards him, and the halberd of time and space devoured the destructive light. Zhou Mian looked at the white-haired figure before him, and there was endless sorrow in his eyes. Was it possible that there was someone this powerful in the world? Futian was not even a saint. He was nothing more than a mid-level sage. He had not even released as much power as he had last time, so how could he be this strong? In front of this kind of power, even a sage of the sages and saints ranking was like an ant. Even if the number 1 figure on the sage ranking appeared before him, he would be killed in a single blow. There was a look in Futian's eyes. It was as if he was indifferent to life. Zhou Mian could clearly feel that in those eyes he was already a dead man. And not only him. The halberd of space and time thrust forward, and Zhou Mian, the brother of the great Zhou sacred king, was pierced through. This all-powerful sage was killed as helplessly as an ant up there in the sky, bringing an end to his glorious life. He had once led an army to attack the Holy Ji Palace, and in that battle had threatened to destroy it. But in the end they had retreated. If he had a chance to do it again, he would have destroyed it no matter the cost. He would have destroyed the palace instead of giving them a chance to breathe. Futian pulled the halberd of time and space out, and Zhou Mian's body fell from the sky. He did not look at it but instead looked to the great Zhou sacred king and said, "Zhou Jiming, do you know how many people are in the great Zhou sacred dynasty?" The great Zhou sacred king looked at the white-haired youth. His eyes looked the same as they had that day outside of Nether Sword Mound. The difference was that back then, Futian had not dared to look at him so arrogantly and stubbornly, or else he would have launched a sacred war against the Holy Ji Palace. But now Futian had invaded the great Zhou sacred dynasty palace, stood in front of him, and killed someone from the great Zhou sacred dynasty. He would not let him kill a second person. "Attack!" The great Zhou sacred king yelled coldly. Niegai and the other great Zhou sacred dynasty cultivators attacked. In an instant terrible storms swept across the sky. There were swords with the ability to kill anything, and great fists that broke through the air. A storm of rule power raged all around, and all of it rushed towards Futian. This terrible storm seemed to want to swallow Futian up and kill him. Some of these attacks were aimed at his flesh, and some sought to destroy his spiritual will. Everything was in chaos. But Futian stood in the air above the great Zhou sacred dynasty palace, and the destructive light still shone around him. He let the endless attacks fall upon him. They enveloped him, but he seemed to not even see them. The destructive light blocked the devastating storm. It smashed into his body and into his spiritual will, but the white-robed figure still stood there calmly, letting all the destructive power fall upon him. He still stood there unmoving. The storm dispersed and his white hair flowed in the wind, dancing like a forest of sharp blades. He gripped the halberd of time and space tightly and swept his gaze over everyone. At that moment the people of the great Zhou sacred dynasty truly knew what it was to despair. How could he be so strong? A mid-level sage was strong enough to ignore the attacks of all the other sages. Could the outcome of this battle be in any doubt? He could destroy everyone in the great Zhou sacred dynasty by himself. No wonder he had brought so few people. Qin Zhuang and the others flashed over and got in position, blocking off all avenues of retreat. They had not come to fight, but to kill. Futian moved, stepping forward and ignoring the spatial distance between him and Niegai. He descended in front of him, thrusting the halberd of time and space forward. Niegai had no power to resist, and it thrust through his forehead. He did not even have a chance to fight back. Sage-level cultivators were like ants before him. The great Zhou sacred king closed his eyes, wishing to completely destroy him. Yi Futian's strength made him realize that there was no chance of anyone under the saint level killing him. No chance at all. So only he and Zhou Yanwang could do it. He did not order a retreat. This was the great Zhou sacred dynasty palace. Where could they retreat to? He would fight to the death here today, and so would the others. Attack! Yelled Yi Futian. He moved forward, transforming into a golden beam of light. Everywhere he passed, crashing sounds rang out as bodies fell from the sky. Chapter 1005. The great Zhou sacred king did not order a retreat, but that did not mean that everyone from the great Zhou sacred dynasty would die here today. Many of them were not nobles of the dynasty, and no noble blood flowed through their veins. In this hopeless situation, if they continued to fight, they would surely die. Some of them began backing away. They had no more stomach for the fight. If saints were on one level and sages on another, then Yi Futian was on his own level. There was no one below them who could challenge this sage. The great Zhou sacred king did not order a retreat, but that did not mean that everyone from the great Zhou sacred dynasty would die here today. Many of them were not nobles of the dynasty, and no noble blood flowed through their veins. In this hopeless situation, if they continued to fight, they would surely die. Some of them began backing away. They had no more stomach for the fight. If saints were on one level and sages on another, then Yi Futian was on his own level. There was no one below them who could challenge this sage. Qin Zhuang and the others in the sword matrix turned into bolts of lightning. The sword matrix swallowed up all the blades of light and surrounded the area. A cultivator who tried to retreat was blocked by a sword. The swordsmen from the Holy Ji Palace moved as one, hunting down those who tried to escape. Yi Futian slowly rose up in the air, and a terrible destructive light appeared behind him. It swept out like a storm of destruction, covering the entire area. Boom! A sage was hit by the light and his spiritual will collapsed. He died there in the air, and his body fell to the earth. Boom! Another powerful spirit elementalist spiritual will was able to resist the light, but his body was crushed to pieces. Blood flew from him as his body fell to the ground. Boom! 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 The devastating light destroyed everything it touched. It was like the end of days. Countless cultivators died at Yi Futian's hands. Everyone's hearts beat wildly as they watched with despair as Yi Futian rose higher and higher. He stood high in the sky like a god. The violent destructive power behind him was the life spirit that he had felt when he had tried St. Zhang's medicine. Forged of rule power, the life spirit bloomed, giving birth to the light of catastrophe of the great path and destroying everything. It seemed that no one could block its attacks. Zhou Jiming glanced at Yi Futian. Up in the air, an image of a huge divine phoenix appeared. It covered the sky and contained immense power within it. As people watched this scene from far away, their hearts beat wildly. They felt that even though they were outside the palace, their safety still could not be guaranteed. If a sacred war broke out, what would it be like? A long rumbling sound rang out as the golden divine phoenix rushed towards Glass Saint, and it seemed to cover the entire area. Glass Saint looked coldly at the great Zhou sacred king. Time and space froze. In an instant, the vast and mighty palace became a giant ice sculpture. Glass Saint held Love Destroyer, and her long hair danced in the wind. She slashed with her sword, and it cut through the sky, leaving long gashes in it. The light that glimmered from the sword could not be captured by the naked eye. Elsewhere, Zhou Yanwang's flames reached into the sky, covering it. He raised his hand and what appeared to be a sun wheel appeared in it. He pressed it down against the village chief, and the sun wheel began to spin, turning into a circle of destructive power. Below them, many buildings in the palace caught fire. A huge sword diagram appeared in front of the village chief. There was the sound of a slashing sword, and countless sword wheels gathered together. The sword diagram grew larger and larger until, in the end, a giant sword came out of its scabbard. It flew out of the sword diagram. It slashed into the sun wheel. He knew that the kinds of attacks that Glass Saint had studied were spirit elemental attacks. The blood seethed in his veins as he continued into the sky. A terrible golden storm bloomed, accompanied by a loud scream. The great Zhou sacred king turned into a golden phoenix and flew right into the storm of sword qi. Endless swords smashed against his giant form, but he seemed not to feel them. The phoenix's huge eyes were filled with incomparable arrogance. The sky burned as the phoenix's golden flame wrapped around Glass Saint. The phoenix that the great Zhou sacred king had turned into rushed out. Glass Saint swept her gaze over its massive form. She did not dodge but brought Love Destroyer back to its original position. In the next instant, she charged into the great Zhou sacred king. At that moment it seemed that she herself had turned into a sword, full of murderous intent. The two incredibly radiant beams of light collided and then separated, and the cultivators outside could not even tell what was happening. They were too fast, faster than the imagination. They were just two beams of light. The divine phoenix turned back into the great Zhou sacred king. His whole body was trembling slightly. His spiritual will was extremely unstable. He could clearly feel cracks appearing in it. Below them, the village chief's sword pressed down on Zhou Yanwang. That was a one-sided battle. Zhou Yanwang was clearly weaker than the village chief. There was the sound of another collision. Zhou Yanwang was knocked back. He spat out a mouthful of blood. There was a scar from the sword across his body. He looked down at the battlefield below him. Yi Futian, Qin Zhuang, and the others were still engaged in a violent slaughter, as they hunted down the cultivators from the great Zhou sacred dynasty. He looked up to where Glass Saint and the great Zhou sacred king were fighting and at Yaya or the sword saint of the void. The terrible storm of destruction above him, and the massive sword diagram were about to get involved in the fight once again. He never would have thought that such a terrible battle would befall the mighty great Zhou sacred dynasty. It was a battle that they had no chance of winning. Attack! A voice appeared in his mind. Zhou Yanwang moved without any hesitation. This time he did not attack the village chief but Yi Futian. "Look out!" yelled the village chief. He turned into a heaven-piercing sword and shot towards Zhou Yanwang. But Zhou Yanwang seemed not to notice him as he continued towards Yi Futian. The sword crossed through the void. There was a loud noise as it pierced through Zhou Yanwang, but he seemed not to feel it. He lifted his hand to strike, wanting to bury Yi Futian right then and there. If he was doomed to die, then he would die and take Yi Futian with him. Yi Futian looked at Zhou Yanwang who was bearing down upon him. He did dodge but moved forward, flying upwards. He roared and the heavens and the earth shook. An endless stream of light appeared flowing backward. He thrust the halberd of time and space forward towards Zhou Yanwang. Boom! A devastating storm raged in the air as Yi Futian was thrown to the ground. Stones flew into the sky as a great hall collapsed. The village chief arrived at where Zhou Yanwang was. He slashed down with the sword and cut through Zhou Yanwang's head from top to bottom. Zhou Yanwang's body trembled. He stared straight downward. And not only him, but the great Zhou sacred king was also looking downward. At that moment, several figures descended from the sky. They appeared all around with terrible auras. They stared coldly at Zhou Yanwang. They were all wearing the same color robes, marking them as 9 states guards. But Zhou Yanwang no longer cared. A noise came from the ruins below, and suddenly a white-haired figure shot up into the sky. He swept his gaze coolly across Zhou Yanwang. How can this be? Zhou Yanwang stared at the unharmed Yi Futian. His heart sank and his eyes looked hollow. He wanted to trade his life for Yi Futian's, but even as a saint he could not kill him. He stood up once again. Boom! There was a loud noise as the village chief smashed Zhou Yanwang's body to pieces. At that moment, the great Zhou sacred king up in the sky was all alone. It seemed that in the whole world he was the only one left fighting. Great Zhou sacred king, please die. Yi Futian looked up at the great Zhou sacred king up in the air. He had asked him to die. Chapter 1006. The sacred king took one look at the broken palaces. The force that had once reigned supreme throughout the eastern state was reduced to ruins on that day. The great Zhou sacred dynasty was going to be destroyed during his reign. Regardless if he were to remain alive or ended up dead, the great Zhou sacred dynasty was no more. The sacred king took one look at the broken palaces. The force that had once reigned supreme throughout the eastern state was reduced to ruins on that day. The great Zhou sacred dynasty was going to be destroyed during his reign. Regardless if he were to remain alive or ended up dead, the Great Zhou sacred dynasty was no more. He took one look at Yi Futian and turned to look at the glass saint, who was shining in brilliant light all over her. His body turned golden and towering light burst from his body. The weather changed and the entire world seemed to have been turned golden, burning in flames. The sacred king seemed to be burning as well. There seemed to be beams shooting down from above, raining down on the sacred king's body. A huge golden phoenix was seen hanging high above the air, looking down at the living beings below. Boundless aura reigned on the sacred king as his form grew increasingly enormous. He wore an incredibly dazzling robe of the golden phoenix, and the phoenix images on the robe looked alive. His life spirit circled above him before charging downward, descending before the sacred king and transformed into a dazzling sword, swallowing the might of the great path around him. The flash of the sword was hot and intense, shining the space all over them and pulsing with towering light. That scene made everyone far away, be it within or outside the royal palace, look at the sky. The scene at the sacred king's palace was simply too stunning. Arg! A voice was heard screaming in agony below. My king, some others howled in pain. There were still many who were below the sage plane in the royal palace of the sacred dynasty. The rules of the sacred war stated that Yi Futian was not allowed to do anything to them. Yet, at that moment, the sky turned extremely scorching and the bodies of many, who were being rained on by the light emanating from the sacred king, burned right away and were reduced to dust within seconds. Back off, Yi Futian said to Qin Zhuang and the others. They were also troubled by what the sacred king did and left the battlefield. The sacred king had gone insane. Shrieks continued to be heard from below, and many continued to die by the might of the divine path. It was not something that sages had an easy time resisting, and it was without doubt more excruciating for the nobles. One palace after another burned. The palaces of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty turned into a sea of golden flames. The sacred king continued to stand high in the air. 2 beams of golden divine flames burned in his eyes. His golden phoenix robe billowed in the wind. The sacred king had truly become one who stood at the pinnacle of the 9 states. He was truly the Great Zhou sacred king at that moment. Terrifying flames lashed out at the glass saint as an extremely huge divine phoenix pounced on the glass saint. However, an area of icy lapis lazuli formed with the glass saint at the center. Golden and silver light clashed and the scene looked stunning. The enormous golden phoenix continued to flap its wings. Boundless golden feathers lashed out at the glass saint's direction. The terrifying golden feathers turned into devastating storms, drowning the glass saint where she stood. The sacred king no longer bothered with her. He took one step to the air and headed straight for Yaya. The sword diagram in the air turned increasing huge, summoning boundless sword will and endless rules of the sword fell from above, descending onto the sword diagram. The sacred king had to stop Yaya. Boom! A sword shot by, yet it was not Yaya's sword. It was the glass saint's love destroyer. She charged straight into the storm and zipped about in the golden currents. The love destroyer split into 9 swords, spinning as they moved forward, conjuring a terrifying vortex. Everything in the vortex's path was all turned to shreds. The sacred king took one look at the glass saint below. The sword that appeared before him shot out right after. The 9 swords were imbued with thousands of sword will and transformed into a screen of swords, clashing the sacred king's sword in an instant. Extremely terrifying aura swept through the place. A huge light screen of the divine phoenix appeared before the 9 swords. That sword had been a manifestation of the sacred king's life spirit. The divine phoenix blocked the towering sword wills. Yet there were countless cuts on the phoenix's body. It was pierced by the sword aura as they rang as if they were howling as they attacked. However, the glass saint was having a hard time as well. A screen of lapis lazuli swords appeared before her. Yet the power brought by the sacred king's sword was able to penetrate it right away. The golden flames wrapped the love destroyer and began to devour it as if the flames intended to just melt it down. The sword screen was turned golden as well. Rainbow light shimmered behind the glass saint, with every single beam seemingly becoming a part of her being infused within the love destroyer. The sacred king's face was twisted. The rainbow light penetrated his defenses and headed straight for his spiritual will, as if intending to break his divine path. Break! The sacred king's eyes continued to burn with golden flames. The great phoenix sword before him continued forward, tearing the love destroyer apart bit by bit. At the same time, the sword that was conjured from his life spirit was shattering as well. Terrifying currents washed all over the place and blood continued to ooze from the sacred king's mouth. The glass saint looked pale as well. The love destroyer was a sword that she had been keeping and maintaining with her spiritual will for many years. It was more than a conventional divine implement, and at the moment it was being destroyed. The sacred king's face looked increasingly disgusted. His eyes were fixed on the glass saint. If he was unable to have her, then no one could have her. Devastating golden flaming storm continued to rage at the glass saint's body. The sacred king shouted, "Kill!" The storm devoured everything, yet at the same time he had a huge sense of crisis welling within him. The village chief attacked from behind. His sword pierced the sacred king's body, going right through his heart. The sacred king's heart continued to beat instead of being destroyed in an instant. It was a testament to his sheer strength. Boom! The sacred king's long hair billowed. His body seemed to have burned completely. Devastating currents tore everything around them apart. The village chief's body seemed to be burning as he retreated right away. "Yes, Palace Lord Yi." The people of the Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple bowed and nodded, a tinge of fear and respect seen in their eyes. Yi Futian took one look at the palace buildings burning below and said, "Let's go." The extreme west of the 9 states was sparsely populated, and the people there were generally of weaker training. There were many common folk there as well. That was the border of the 9 states after all, so prosperity and liveliness were not descriptions that applied. There was a small city at the border, and with the city there was a small restaurant. A group of people was in that restaurant. They were dressed plainly and wore conical hats. However, their faces revealed their exceptional bearing. The likes of Zhouya and Zhouyu were all there. All of them were descendants of the sacred king. All of them clenched their fists as they looked at the broken jade scroll on the table. Their father, the sacred king, had perished. It was not only the sacred king, as even their mother perished in the battle. Father really is brutal indeed. The very reason why they stayed as long as they did was that they still had hope, not believing that the Holy Ji Palace would truly be able to wipe out the Great Zhou sacred dynasty. However, with the demise of their father, everything was set. As long as Yi Futian lived, then their goal would be to kill him. "Let's go," one of them said, and everyone stood up and went outside. They did not even bother using divine implements due to wanting to maintain secrecy. They simply ran all the way instead. They appeared at the walls of a small city, looking at the vast, desolate desert before them. It was said that the lands next to the 9 states were Emperor Li's realm. Unlike the 9 states, both the upper and lower worlds of Emperor Li's realm was directly ruled by the Dali dynasty. The lower worlds were ruled by people of the Dali dynasty as well. All of those fugitives had one secret in their hand, which would have sufficed in getting them access to the upper worlds of the Dali dynasty. "Let's go." The figures took to the air, and their eyes looked determined. All of them fumed with extreme murderous intent. Not far away from where they stood, there was a figure covered in a cloak in the desert, looking extremely dangerous. No one had been aware of his presence before. That made Zhouya and the rest of the party stop. They put up their guard as they looked at him, saying, "Who are you?" They all had a bad feeling about this. Do you people really think that you can go against Emperor Xia's orders just like that? That figure took his cloak off and looked at them with a pair of pitch-black eyes. Everyone in the party felt like they had been thrown into purgatory. If you were willing to hide within the 9 states, you might have been able to survive. His voice sounded like the Reapers. That man then turned into a blitzing mirage, leaving behind dead bodies on the sands shortly after. The pressure upon them was immense as 2 of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty's saints were dead. The Holy Ji Palace had 4 saints, and with the addition of the glass saint, the enemy consisted of 5 saints. One could only imagine what was going through Saint Shihua's mind in such a situation. "Saint, my father died in battle. How could you say such things?" Zhou Zi's eyes got more red. She looked at Saint Shihua with rather cold eyes. She knew that she was nothing before Saint Shihua, but having suffered the death of both her husband and her father, The blow was simply too heavy for her to stay reasonable. Slap. A crisp sound was heard and Zhou Zi's body was sent flying. It was not from Saint Xihua, as he could not have cared less. An elder behind him slapped Zhou Zi by flinging his sleeve instead. "You're too much, Zhou Zi," the elder said plainly with cold eyes. Blood was seen at the corner of Zhou Zi's mouth. Her face was ashen as she sat on the ground. Tears were seen all over her face. She naturally recognized that elder. It was an elder from Xihua Sacred Mountain. When Lu Zong was still alive, he had been all smiles and polite. There was no way he would have treated her like that back then. She wiped the blood at the corner of her mouth with her white sleeve. Zhou Zi glared at the elder and said, "If my husband and father were still alive, they would have had your head." She paid no heed to consequences. She suffered one such humiliation as soon as her father died. As a princess of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty, her status had been of unparalleled privilege, so one could have only imagined how much of a shock that was to her. The elder frowned and heard Saint Xihua said, "This is getting noisy. I'll take her away at once." The elder bowed and walked towards Zhou Zi. He burst with the power of rules and let the pressure wash over Zhou Zi. "How dare you touch me?" Zhou Zi's eyes were bloodshot and filled with murderous intent. However, the elder could not have cared less. He picked her up by the collar and took her away. Arg! Zhou Zi's mind felt as if it was about to shatter from the humiliation she suffered. However, no one paid any heed to the scene. No one spoke up on her behalf. She was showered with nothing but coldness. Zhou Zi laughed loudly without care all of a sudden. "Saint Xihua, for better or worse, I'm the wife of your personal student, a princess of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. My husband is gone and my father is dead. You shall die a horrible death for treating me like that. You're indeed too much." The elder took one look at her and pressed his hand on her chest. A devastating power raged all over her body and blood spewed from her mouth, but she no longer cared. "Did you really think that Lu Zong liked you? You of all people?" The elder squatted down and whispered in Zhou Zi's ear. He then took a look at her and said coldly, "If it had not been for your status as the princess of the Sacred Dynasty, you would have died many times over. Both Lu Zong and the Sacred King are dead, and you are still unable to see the state of things clearly. You actually dared to talk back to Saint Xihua. You've been living too comfortably indeed," the elder thought. "Kill me then," Zhou Zi said in a low voice. "If you want to die, get off the mountain." The elder continued to haul her away. Zhou Zi was like the walking dead. She was thrown off the mountain soon enough by that elder. She never dreamed of the day where she, the high and mighty princess of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty, would have met such an end. If her father was still alive, given his overbearing temperament, he would have come all the way to Xihua Sacred Mountain for her. Zhou Zi got up and straightened herself up. She flashed and made her way outside the mountain. She saw the army of the Holy Ji Palace from afar, and she walked in their direction. The people of the Holy Ji Palace looked at her walking with cold eyes. The one who stood at the very front of the army was Yushang. He stood guard in that direction and led an army. Zhou Zi naturally recognized Yushang. She knew him from the Chess Saint Villa 8 years ago. Yushang and Yi Futian appeared in the Chess Saint Villa back then, breaking the Celestial Dragon chess game. However, no one paid any heed to small fries like him and Yi Futian back then. Lu Zong, the student tutored by all three saints of Xihua Sacred Mountain, was there after all. She, like the others, paid no heed to either Yi Futian and Yushang. Her eyes had been on Lu Zong. But when she came to think about it, she had probably been prejudiced right from the start, acknowledging Lu Zong's exceptional qualities but never looking at Yi Futian and Yushang properly. She found them repulsive despite both of them being extremely exceptional, not willing to acknowledge them. Her husband, Lu Zong, had died in battle while everyone throughout the 9 states came to know Yi Futian's name. While Yushang was not as renowned as Yi Futian, he stood there nonetheless, standing guard in a corner like a god. Those contemptuous eyes were filled with overbearing might. She had to acknowledge it despite not wanting to do so. She had to acknowledge the party led by Yi Futian, appearing in the Chess Saint Villa all those years ago, had been exceptional beings, and they changed the power balance of the 9 states. They wiped out the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty as they wrote a legend that belonged to them. "Kill me." Zhou Zi looked at Yushang and said. Yu Shang's cold eyes took one look at her and he did nothing. He simply said, "Kill her." A spear flew right at her as soon as he finished, piercing her heart right there and then. She looked before her intently but was unable to even determine who was it who had killed her. Yu Shang did not bother to do it personally. She smirked and felt that she was pathetic. Her body dropped lifelessly to the ground soon enough. Chapter 1008. Up on the holy mountain, Saint Xihua looked at the holy land that had been passed down for many years and sighed in his heart. Up on the holy mountain, Saint Xihua looked at the holy land that had been passed down for many years and sighed in his heart. I wanted to let Xihua Sacred Mountain reach the peak of all Eastern State before leaving to cultivate. Now it seems that this wish will never be fulfilled. Saint Xihua whispered as if talking to himself. Senior brother has worked hard for the foundation of Xihua Sacred Mountain for many years and single-handedly made Xihua Sacred Mountain an unofficial #1 holy place in the Eastern State. Lu Zong's talent was outstanding, and he had the potential to be the one to unify the Eastern State. But what men plan the heavens must bless. Yi Futian of the barren state caused today's situation. It is not your fault, besides Saint Xihua, a tall and massive man said. This person was the #2 saint of the Xihua Sacred Mountain, the junior brother of Saint Xihua Mad Saint. This moniker came from his fighting style, as he was the fighting madman of Xihua Sacred Mountain. The two brothers had laid the foundation for Xihua Sacred Mountain. However, no one had thought that things could have changed so fast. The Holy Ji Palace of Barren State had risen at an unstoppable speed, even growing in chaos, facing annihilation more than once. But today it stood firmly atop all the lands in the 9 states. During the time Yi Futian returned to Qingzhou City, all the saints dared not to invade the Holy Ji Palace. The returning Sword Saint of the Void and Saint Zhang were all great threats. Under the circumstances of Saint Ji being under house arrest, none of them had enough confidence to act. Saint Xihua looked up at the sky and sighed in his heart. They grew up on Xihua Sacred Mountain and had deep feelings for this sacred mountain. All they had wanted was to let Xihua Sacred Mountain stand on the top of 9 states with a firm foundation, which they could pass down from generation to generation. After all, in the world of cultivation they all knew that once you were weak, it was easy to be replaced or destroyed. If you didn't move forward, you would disappear in the torrent of history. And now the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty was just such a fitting example. And now it seemed it was Xihua Sacred Mountain's time. No one could stop the march of time. Suddenly he remembered the 9-state forum that year. Who then, among all the holy lands of 9 states, would look at Yi Futian from the barren state? After 9-state forum, after Yu Shang took first place, their attention was somewhat aroused, but those from the noble plane could never affect the overall situation of 9 states. And then at the Nether Sword Mound, because of what he and Lu Zong wanted to do, they caused a direct confrontation with Yi Futian that was doomed to be irreconcilable. Therefore, they had wanted to make the Holy Ji Palace disappear for good. But at that time, they thought that the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty was enough. They never expected that the outcome of the First Sacred War would cause everything that happened later. It's hard to let go, Saint Xihua whispered. Master, do what is wise, the Rain Saint said, to which Saint Xihua gently nodded. Now that they were at an absolute disadvantage, the Moon Saint might come over and join in the fight, but under such circumstances, even the saint from the Hall of Holy Light may not be of much use. Especially now that Saint Ji was under house arrest and the Hall of Holy Light itself was well protected by natural barriers, there was not much chance that anyone there would want to venture out. If they insisted on staying to battle, they would face the same consequences as the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. The Great Zhou Sacred King and Zhou Yanwang were an example that ought to be hearkened. That was the reason for him to reprimand the Great Zhou Sacred King as an idiot who did not know when to leave the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty behind before it was too late. But it was all for the best, and they were reminded early to have time to make a decision. Since a decision was made, Saint Xihua hesitated no more. He levitated slowly, and a faint pressure shrouded all of Xihua Sacred Mountain. In front of all the palaces of the Sacred Mountain, the army stood solemnly, fully taking advantage of its geographical location, waiting to launch the matrix, preparing for war. Feeling the pressure, they all looked up above the void and saw Saint Xihua. Saint Xihua looked at the Sacred Mountain. Lu Zong had died in battle, along with the other 2 sages who also died in the same battle. In the previous battle, Xihua Sacred Mountain had suffered great losses, and many hopefuls from the next generation were killed. Although today's Xihua Sacred Mountain had many powerful sages, in fact, they could no longer support Xihua Sacred Mountain as a holy land. Our Xihua Sacred Mountain has stood in the eastern state for many years, and has produced many generations of cultivators. Many of you have been cultivating at Xihua Sacred Mountain for many years to reach your achievements today. Now Xihua Sacred Mountain is at the crossroad of life and death, but saints cannot touch you at all. Mad Saint, Rain Saint, and I will leave so that other saints will not make a move against you, not even in successive waves of attacks. Xihua Sacred Mountain is now relying on you to protect it. Saint Xihua spoke clearly and sounded tragic, but everyone who was listening closely understood the hidden meaning. Saint Xihua and the 3 saints were ready to abandon Xihua Sacred Mountain. Suddenly many people were pale, and they did not look well. Even the Lord of Xihua Sacred Mountain had given up? At one point the Holy Ji Palace of the Barren State faced the same situation as you. That was the reason why the Holy Ji Palace is where it is today. I am hoping that our disciples of Xihua Sacred Mountain can do the same. Saint Xihua continued. Originally, the saints of the Holy Ji Palace did not dare to return precisely, because they wished to avoid the ire of Xihua Sacred Mountain and the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. But even when Saint Xihua said this, the hearts of many cultivators of Xihua Sacred Mountain were still shaken. Yi Futian, Palace Lord of the Holy Ji Palace of Barren State, always guarded the palace with the resolve to live and die with the palace. If the palace lived, so would he, and if the palace perished, then he would too. What do you have that can be compared to that? When Dozhan heard that Saint Xihua was ready to run, he could not help but make this sarcastic comment. Even at this time, Saint Xihua still wanted to incentivize the disciples of Xihua Sacred Mountain to fight to the death, not hesitating to sacrifice the lives of everyone at Xihua Sacred Mountain just to inflict deaths and injuries of those at the Holy Ji Palace. It was extremely despicable. Clearly, Saint Xihua himself realized that the truth of the matter was that he could no longer keep Xihua Sacred Mountain safe, and it was irreversible. Therefore, he decided that it was better to sacrifice the disciples of Xihua Sacred Mountain in exchange for an epic battle. To him, the cultivators of Xihua Sacred Mountain were like chess pieces. Dozhan's voice sounded throughout Xihua Sacred Mountain. The hearts of many were stirred up, and there was no longer any motivation to fight. If it was indeed like Dozhan stated, when the Holy Ji Palace was the one retreating back then, the person who really decided the life or death of the palace was not them but Yi Futian. Yi Futian, the palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace, had always fought side by side with the palace. In contrast, the words of Saint Xihua appeared particularly hypocritical. Xihua Sacred Mountain has the help of the Matrix. It's enough to allow our disciples of Xihua Sacred Mountain to have the power to battle. If you choose to listen to the lies of these people from the Holy Ji Palace, you are responsible for the outcome. Saint Xihua snorted and continued, "This battle is controlled by you, and your destiny is in your own hands." When he finished, Saint Xihua rose up, and beside him, the Mad Saint and the Rain Saint followed suit, standing on either side of him. Their eyes glanced at Saint Jiang and Dozhan, ready to leave. When you announced to join the sacred war, what posture you had. But now you are no better than a dog that has no master, abandoning Xihua Sacred Mountain. How worthy you are. Yushang looked up at Saint Xihua, who was above the firmament. His voice was extremely cold. Saint Xihua was rebuked by a youngster, but he looked indifferently at Yushang. After you and Yi Futian became saints, remember not to walk around where you don't belong, Saint Xihua said coldly, and then the 3 flashed away in retreat. Saint Jiang and Dozhan did not give chase. They had 3 saints, while Saint Xihua and Mad Saint were of the same realm as Saint Jiang, and although they ranked behind Saint Jiang clearly, the 2 of them could not have stopped the retreat of all 3 of them. If you knew that they would be sanctified sooner or later, where are you going? Saint Jiang asked casually. They would not be able to walk out of Emperor Xia's realm. Emperor Xia would not tolerate betrayal. In this case, Yi Futian would grow to the point where he could kill him. Saint Xihua snorted, and the 3 saints left in the air. Outside of the sacred mountain, countless cultivators of Futian City, who had witnessed this scene, only felt a sense of sarcasm. Saint Shihua, the master of Shihua Sacred Mountain, had, in fact, abandoned the sacred mountain and fled. Looking at the sacred mountain that was still standing in the sky, everyone in Futian City understood one thing. The era that belonged to Shihua Sacred Mountain was over. The three saints had left. Shihua Sacred Mountain effectively had no leader, not even someone who could command the rest. At the moment, there were whispers among the cultivators. Their hearts were scattered. Even among cultivators, how many of them were not afraid of death? Now, even the Lord of the Sacred Mountain had escaped. It could be seen that the ending of Shihua Sacred Mountain had been determined, and how could there still be the will to fight? Their convictions had collapsed. Shihua Mountain was in a sad atmosphere. Just then, a person stepped out and said to Saint Zhang and Dozhan, "Revered elders, the sacred war was initiated by Saint Shihua. We were just following orders. Now that Saint Shihua has abandoned Shihua Sacred Mountain, Shihua Sacred Mountain is a name only, and we are willing to surrender." As he finished speaking, many figures levitated and looked at the sacred mountain, saying, "We would also like to surrender." "Not accepted." An indifferent and blunt voice interrupted the people of Shihua Sacred Mountain. Everyone looked at Yushang, who was on the outset of the holy mountain. His body like a demon god. His cold eyes swept to those who belonged to Shihua Sacred Mountain. When they were strong, they had wanted to exterminate the Holy Ji Palace. How many disciples had perished in that battle, including Hua Jieyu. Yi Futian and him had also faced the crisis of life and death. Now it was their turn to be under siege and they wanted to surrender? Countless people of the Shihua Sacred Mountain looked ashen. Was battling the only way? An elder looked at everyone from Shihua Sacred Mountain and sighed. If they want to fight, then with the support of our matrix let them pay. Although their hope was gone, he was a sage after all. The state of mind was still stable. Since the situation was already desperate, then it would be a fight to the death. The Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty is now just a memory. Its palace smoldering in ashes. Yi Futian and the cultivators of the Yu clan are on their way here. Who are you going to make pay for all this? Dozhan said coldly, and his words extinguished any motivation the cultivators of Shihua Sacred Mountain had. Had the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty indeed been exterminated? Yi Futian was not here, so he must have gone to the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. Now he would invade Shihua Sacred Mountain, along with the cultivators of the Yu clan. Fight to the death? With what? It was only waiting for death to come. Fight our way out. However, many people can still escape, some said desperately, not prepared to employ the matrix any longer. Instead of waiting to die, it was far better to fight their way out, which at the very least offered a chance of survival. Chapter 1009. Shihua Sacred Mountain was shrouded in a mood of desperation. Saint Shihua had abandoned the sacred mountain and escaped. They were now surrounded by the Holy Ji Palace. They were truly at a dead end. Shihua Sacred Mountain was shrouded in a mood of desperation. Saint Shihua had abandoned the sacred mountain and escaped. They were now surrounded by the Holy Ji Palace. They were truly at a dead end. Many people levitated skyward. What the man said was right. There were only two choices before them. They could wait for the other side to launch the attack and hope that with the power of the Matrix, they may slaughter more people on the other side. The second choice was to fight their way out before Yi Futian arrived with powerful reinforcements. But the ending would remain the same. They would all perish on Shihua Sacred Mountain. Obviously, the second choice offered a little more chance to survive. To them, it was meaningless to kill anyone from the Holy Ji Palace for any reason. All the forces now gathered to form the Matrix. Even if they were prepared to flee, they had to do their utmost to increase their chances. Otherwise, like a plate of sand, they would all die with no possibility of survival. As if the movement upon Shihua Sacred Mountain had been detected, a great pressure descended from heaven and a demonic air permeated into the space. Immense demonic beasts guarded the sky above, preventing them from breaking through. Not only that, but the other four sides of Shihua Sacred Mountain surrounded. They continued to climb upward and appeared on the side in the sky. In case those from Shihua Sacred Mountain chose to escape from the top, they could instantly form a circle and cut them off. In these four directions, right in front were the cultivators led by Yushang. The battle at the Holy Ji Palace had left them dreading the power of Yushang, making this route incredibly dangerous. The other 3 routes were Yuan Hong's heavenly battle matrix, guarding one direction, with cultivators who were even more expert at martial arts. After experiencing many sacred battles, Yuan Hong's strength exceeded what it was in the past, and his fighting ability was getting stronger by leaps and bounds. It was enough to rank among the sages on the Sage and Saint ranking of 9 states. Besides Yuan Hong, there was also the battle matrix headed by Yun Shang of the Ice Temple, which was good at control. With them assisting the great offensive of the heavenly battle matrix, it was unstoppable. Sword Saint was also guarding one direction with a group of cultivators, such as Zhuge Qingfeng, Yu Qi, and others. Now the cultivation of Sword Saint was closer to a top-level sage. Aided by the strength of the demonic blade, his power was even more astounding. Coupled with the support of Zhuge Qingfeng and Yu Qi, he was well equipped to guard this position. The last direction was defended by Yang Xiao and Gu Donglu, who were both on the sage ranking and possessed equally amazing strength. Those who had experienced the battle at the Holy Ji Palace knew how Lu Zong died. Gu Donglu and Bai Luli of Jixia Holy Palace White Palace man Yang Zhao's battle matrix, killing Lu Zong. Now Gu Donglu was already a mid-level sage, whose ability also caused people of Xihua Sacred Mountain to feel uncertain, for major directions seemed to have been completely locked down. Which direction was the weakest? In those days there were not many people who could really represent the Holy Ji Palace. Qin Zhuang and the 9 were the most well-known. Now, even those who were of the lower planes at the Holy Ji Palace had risen, like Yushang and Gu Donglu. They were now able to stand in their own power and call the shots on their own. Even in the absence of Yi Futian and Qin Zhuang, they could still suppress Xihua Sacred Mountain in their own right. In less than 10 years' time, since the last 9 states forum, situations had been turned upside down. Back then, in all the holy lands of the 9 states, no one cared much about the cultivators from the barren states. Matrix, prepare for battle, someone said. Suddenly, on the top of Xihua Sacred Mountain, its mighty army gathered together to form a battle matrix. A tyrannical pressure swept through the sacred mountain. Far away, the cultivators in Futian city, who witnessed this scene, felt incredible fear in their hearts. Xihua Sacred Mountain was surrounded and forced deeper into an impossible situation. Follow me, the cultivator called out loudly and clearly, and as his voice fell, he embarked in one direction. It was the location right in front of them where Yushang was. They had chosen to escape from the front and had concentrated all their forces into this one position, hoping for an opportunity that would allow them to open up a gap in a short time. Their purpose was not to battle but to fight their way out. Naturally, the best choice was to gather all their power to direct at Yushang. For Yushang, although he was strong, it was only because he was massive. The army started and a suffocating power coursed in the direction of Yushang and his party, and all the cultivators from the 3 major directions also stepped forward and headed over. Yushang's eyes coldly swept toward the mighty army. His eyes turned into demonic eyes with a blood-red glow, and mighty demonic power came out. The dark golden demonic light darkened the sky, with the demonic power covering the sky. His body increased in size, turning into a demon god. Wherever his eyes passed, they struck fear into the hearts of the cultivators of Xihua Sacred Mountain. They were a pair of terrible demon eyes. The bat leaks of judgment appeared in his hand, and the magic that poured into it made the axe to release a dark magical light, as if it was now incarnated into a demonic bat leaks. Yushang, after being demonized, had an aura that was closer to a top-level sage. Behind Yushang, there suddenly appeared many statues of demon gods, and it was the 108 demon gods who stood proudly in the universe, surveying all living creatures. Upon the body of Yushang was a layer of dark gold armor, like the armor of the demon god. Immense and boundless demon wings appeared and flapped in the void. What was taking place before their eyes was so radiant and beautiful that it was terrifying. The cultivators of Xihua Sacred Mountain regretted to have chosen to try and get past Yushang's defense. Dozhang glanced at Yushang. After breaking through the sage plane, Yushang had become more powerful, tapping directly into the secret arts to motivate the strongest of all demonic magic, and further integrated the technique of Buddhism into demonic magic, thus releasing the strongest fighting form. This was intended to entrap every single person of Xihua Sacred Mountain. Presumably, that first battle had not only infuriated Yi Futian, but also Yu Shang. Dozhan looked again at the battle matrix behind Yu Shang. At the center of the battle matrix was Huang Jioga. At this time, he had gathered the power of everyone to allow his own power to climb to the epitome of the sage. The magnificent Run Huang will bloomed out, its golden brilliance soaring to the sky in unspeakable radiance. The Run Huang bow that had melted into the life spirit of the imperial implement now pulled back the bowstring. Suddenly, with his body as the center, there were thousands of shadows of the arrows that released a power that could penetrate everything. It locked onto all the cultivators of Shihua Sacred Mountain. Was it not the same with Huang Jioga? What was the reason for the 7 holy lands to join forces together to invade the Holy Ji Palace? The inheritance of Run Huang. Yi Futian once claimed that if he could not protect Huang Jioga, he was not qualified to protect the Holy Ji Palace. Such reasoning had carried with it an incredible price. Once at the Run Huang ruins and once at the battle in the Holy Ji place was enough for him to entrust his life to Yi Futian. Boom! Like a demon god, Yu Shang took a single step and the demonic wings flashed, descending in front of the crowd that was rushing at him. Using his own power, he had cut through in the midst of the army of Shihua Sacred Mountain. Kill! The cultivators of Shihua Sacred Mountain let out a roar. Suddenly, countless launched their attacks at Yu Shang. The pressure seemed to be able to kill everything. Even the people of the Holy Ji Palace felt fear in their hearts, concerned for Yu Shang. But Yu Shang seemed to not have felt it at all. The batliks of judgment came down from the sky and opened heaven and earth with a fissure. The giant mountains that had been smashed forward were shattered and pulverized from the middle, and the batliks of judgment was unstoppable. As it chopped from the sky, there was a dark demonic light of magic. In an instant, the battle matrix in front of him collapsed, and countless cultivators were split open by the axe. Blood stained the sky, but there were still countless attacks coming from the side and blasting on his demon godlike body. With all 108 illusions of demon gods protecting him with their magnificent demonic power, Yu Shang did not budge at all. The batliks of judgment in his hand struck down. As the axe fell, another straight dark magical light appeared, widening the scope of its attack further this time. The cultivators of Shihua Sacred Mountain condensed the strongest of their defensive power, but the battle matrix was still insanely collapsing. One strong man charged. None could stop him. Go. The great army now tried to flee in different directions. However, many people felt that they were being locked down. And in the next moment, the Run Huang Bao shot out brilliant arrows, slashing through the sky. Pust! The golden arrow pierced through a head, which replayed itself again and again in many places, and they were all sages. The cultivators of Shihua Sacred Mountain had lost any will to remain in the battle matrix and continue fighting. Now they were looking for any opening for an escape, and regardless of the cost, they were trying to break out in all directions. They knew they could ill afford the time, as the other 3 forces would soon be upon them. After Yu Shang struck one more time with the axe, he levitated. Above the firmament, the power of destruction gathered into a demonic halberd. Its power seemed to be without end. Kill! Yu Shang shouted. The endless demonic halberd fell from the sky, intending to completely close off this space. But there were still individuals rushing out, attempting to escape. One of the top-level sages moved with insanely fast speed. It was someone who was an expert at the rules of the wind. It was like a hurricane. But at this moment the same hurricane swept through. He looked up and saw a huge condor coming at him. Although it was technically a condor, it was more terrifying than the roc. Its sharp claws and wings were shining with the luster of black gold. This top sage had set off a terrible hurricane storm, and it attacked the black-winged condor. However, the eyes of the black-winged condor were full of scorn. Its sharp claws came down, penetrating the hurricane storm, and the void seemed to be on the verge of being split in two. With a loud bang, the body of that cultivator was pulled apart, and the sharp claws of the black-winged condor tossed it out. With a flash of its wings, it continued to hunt cultivators in the other directions. This short time was enough for the cultivators to join the fight from the other 3 positions. The Sword of Sword Saint struck from the rear, while the infinite ruler of Yuan Hong slammed down from the sky. They were also surrounded by the halo of the 9 characters. The characters fell down from the sky and annihilated everything. They still had a number of cultivators guarding the other 3 major positions to prevent sneaky attacks from these 3 positions. There were indeed many in Xihua Sacred Mountain who had such thoughts. After seeing the army had launched its offensive, they were waiting for an opportunity to escape. But when they saw that all 3 positions were heavily guarded, they looked at the slaughter on the battlefield. It was clearly a one-sided massacre. The cultivators at Xihua Sacred Mountain were all just focused on escaping. There was no strong intent to fight this war. In addition, they had already lost several top fighters before, so it was impossible for them to stop the Holy Ji Palace in its prime. Their only thought was to escape, but the Holy Ji Palace seemed to not want any of them to slip through their fingers. Outside Xihua Sacred Mountain, some of the cultivators in Futian City observed the battlefield from a distance, and when they saw that no one had escaped, there were great emotions in their hearts. This sacred mountain, the holy land of Eastern State, would soon be a thing of history. Chapter 10:10. The fight at Xihua Sacred Mountain was already over when Yi Futian and the Moon Saint got there. The people of the Holy Ji Palace were cleaning up the battlefield, picking up any leftovers and searching for any treasures in Xihua Sacred Mountain. However, they found that the divine implements and palace library had been almost emptied. It was apparent that Saint Xihua transported items away. He had long prepared to escape the place, and it had not been something he just decided on a whim. The fight at Xihua Sacred Mountain was already over when Yi Futian and the Moon Saint got there. The people of the Holy Ji Palace were cleaning up the battlefield, picking up any leftovers and searching for any treasures in Xihua Sacred Mountain. However, they found that the divine implements and palace library had been almost emptied. It was apparent that Saint Xihua transported items away. He had long prepared to escape the place, and it had not been something he just decided on a whim. At that moment, Yi Futian, Yu Shang, the Moon Saint, Saint Jiang, and many others were at the highest peak of Xihua Sacred Mountain, casting their gaze down on many of the shuddering nobles and people of lower training. Saint Xihua and the others probably won't dare to stay behind in the 9 states any longer, the Moon Saint said coldly. He abandoned Xihua Sacred Mountain and left the Holy Land to its devices, escaping alone. He really was apathetic and heartless. But then again, it was not something unfathomable. When someone had reached a level as high as Saint Xihua, they would not want to die in battle alongside the Holy Land. Xihua Sacred Mountain was not the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty, and Saint Xihua was not Zhou Jiming. The Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty was a sovereign and the lineage was passed down through blood. Zhou Jiming was overbearing and ruthless, making it unthinkable for him to run like a loser. He would have rather died standing, perishing within the royal palace of the Sacred Dynasty. According to Yi Futian, the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty had been burned down by the Sacred King himself. Everyone from the Sacred Dynasty died. He was indeed ruthless even at the very end. Yi Futian took one look at the sky, wondering if Saint Xihua had made for the upper worlds. Is there a possibility of that he had left Emperor Xia's realm? He asked. Impossible. The Moon Saint shook his head and continued. Emperor Xia reigned all over the 9 states and the masters of holy lands were all extensions of his power. If it had been the old times, it would have been possible for Saint Xihua to venture outside and train. But given the times, leaving Emperor Xia's realm would be tantamount to walking to his own death. Yi Futian knew well about the times that the Moon Saint mentioned. Emperor Xia would have sent people to monitor things in the 9 states. All who had participated in that sacred war in the Holy Ji Palace would be put under surveillance. The Sacred Dynasty was raised and there were only some nobles left in Xihua Sacred Mountain, posing little threat to the victors. Saint Xia had gathered the saints and intimidated them into putting lockdowns on news regarding that battle. The saints would not have dared spread the news as they feared for their own lives. Even if someone from Xihua Sacred Mountain actually learned about news regarding that battle, the level of their training meant that there would be no way for them to make it out of the 9 states alive. We'll deal with the Hall of Holy Light and the 3 holy lands of the Endless Ocean next, Yi Futian said with a low voice. I'm afraid it'll be difficult to take the Hall of Holy Light out, the Moon Saint said. Why would that be? Yi Futian asked. The Hall of Holy Light possessed the grand matrix of holy light protection, absorbing the essence of powers of the heaven and the earth and boundless power of light, encasing the entire hall of holy light within. With Saint Ji taking the helm, there was no way we would have been able to break the place, even with the saints collaborating to do so, unless the Sword Saint of the Void returned to what he had once been, the Moon Saint said. Yi Futian was silent for a bit. While Yaya had broken into Saint Plane, invoking the powers of the Sword Matrix of the Void would cost a lot of energy. She had almost exhausted her powers by breaking the Grand Matrix of the Sacred Dynasty. If the one at the Hall of Holy Light proved to be more powerful, then not even Yaya would be able to break it. But then again, Saint Ji was put under house arrest for 10 years, which meant that he would not be able to pose a threat to the Holy Ji Palace for the time being as well. I'll take a team with me to the Hall of Holy Light of the Qi State and sit right outside. We'll take down any sages who dare step outside, Yu Shang said. While his aura had been diminished, he was not all that spent and damaged from that battle. While he would not be able to continue doing great battles, he was anything but weak at the moment. He became able to resist recoil of demonization powers better after growing stronger after all. We're in no hurry, Yi Futian said. While the Hall of Holy Light was protected by a grand matrix, the fact that they had become a rat in a hole remained, robbing them of any ability to cause any further trouble. However, Yi Futian still felt incomplete deep down for not being able to kill Saint Xihua and Saint Ji right away. Saint Ji and Saint Xihua were both the masterminds and root cause for the formation of the alliance of the 7 Holy Lands against the Holy Ji Palace after all. One silhouette after another flashed and returned behind Yi Futian. Palace Lord, we're done cleaning up, the Sword Demon said. Well then, Yi Futian nodded and said, let's head back. He stepped forward as soon as he finished. We're going home, one voice after another said. Mighty ones from the Holy Ji Palace took to the air right away and gathered around. The village chief summoned huge swords and the grand army stepped onto them, streaking through the skies as they left. Many from Xihua Sacred Mountain had their knees on the ground crying after the ones from the Holy Ji Palace left. Xihua Sacred Mountain was no more. One figure after another stepped forward from Futian City into Xihua Sacred Mountain. They were just as sentimental and exasperated. 3 holy lands stood tall in the eastern state once. The Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple had disbanded, the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty was raised, and the Xihua Sacred Mountain was no more as well. But then again, those people's minds were filled with greed as well. The place had once been somewhere they had wanted to step into. What the ones from the Holy Ji Palace deemed worthless still meant something to common mages. Furthermore, with Xihua Sacred Mountain reigning over Futian City for so many years, there would have definitely been many people and forces oppressed and bullied by Xihua Sacred Mountain. With Saint Xihua currently on the run, Xihua Sacred Mountain abandoned, and the sages dead, any of Sage Plane training would have been able to do whatever they please with the place. It was only natural that many felt their hands itchy in such a situation. Many mighty ones flashed and charged right inside the mountain to keep pillaging the place. Furthermore, more and more people showed up from Futian City, turning the place chaotic, and there were many from Xihua Sacred Mountain ended up dead in the chaos. It seemed ironic that Xihua Sacred Mountain, which had been grand and imposing in its heyday, ended up in such tragedy. The news of the demise of both Xihua Sacred Mountain and the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty of the Eastern States spread throughout the 9 states like wildfire. The news caused intense shock. Many were exasperated. No one had expected that the Holy Ji Palace of the Barren State would be able to take out Jisheng Cliffs, then the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty, and finally Xihua Sacred Mountain. If it had not been for the Hall of Holy Light being protected by Holy Light, Yi Futian would have probably sent forces to wipe them out long ago as well. As for the 3 holy lands of the Endless Ocean, Yi Futian had no plans to go there. That was because he found from the surveillance of the demonic beasts of the sea that all 3 of the holy lands disbanded after he took down the 2 at the eastern state. All of the mighty ones from the 3 holy lands scattered throughout the Endless Ocean, and locating them one by one would have been immensely difficult. Out of the 7 holy lands, 3 were raised and 3 disbanded, with the last one shutting its gates to the outside world. That was the outcome of the sacred war that had been the talk of the 9 states all those years ago. Many claimed that the sage and saint rankings of the 9 states should be rearranged. It was especially so in the case of the sage ranking. Given so many had lost their lives in the war, Yi Futian should have been ranked first on the sage ranking, for none under the saints were able to beat him. It was also said that he was, at the moment, only a mid-level archmage instead of an upper-level one. Yi Futian, who had shaken the 9 states all over, was, at the moment, found sitting in a quiet corner of the Holy Sage Pavilion, playing a tune. The tune was a winding one with tinges of sadness in it. With so many of his enemies still alive, raising both the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty and Xihua Sacred Mountain meant little to him. Furthermore, even if he had ended up killing all of his enemies, there was still no way Jieyu could be resurrected. Lulan Shui listened at the side quietly and did not disturb Yi Futian. She was able to hear the faint sadness in the tune. Though it had been over a year since his return to the Holy Ji Palace, he was still unable to put the part of his past behind him. Lulan Shui saw them both being together for over a dozen years right until the end of the war. Those years had been the best years of their lives. While both of them jested a lot when they talked, the bond between the two of them was something that only they could understand. Hua Jieyu's death was a huge blow to Yi Futian, and Lulan Shui probably knew that better than everyone else. Zhuge Mingyue and Beitang Xing'er came to her side and listened to Yi Futian play quietly, without any words to say. The tune finally stopped after some time. Yi Futian then looked up and smiled. Second sister, Sister Xing'er, you're still very good at playing the guqin, I see, just like how it was back in the cottage, Beitang Xing'er quipped. While she was already in her 30s, she still looked as pure and flawless as she had been. Her clear eyes had a simple rustic feel to them. With the brothers and sisters at the cottage being the ones to take care of things, she had been the one with the least troubles. She was carefree and there had been no need to care about anything going on outside. While her talents were not superb, she had only needed to dedicate herself to her training. The state of mind is now different though, Yi Futian said. He missed those years. Don't get too caught up with wild thoughts. Zhuge Mingyue then glared at him and said, Yu Shang brought a group of people with him and left the Holy Ji Palace. He's probably heading to the Hall of Holy Light. Yi Futian was dumbfounded for a bit before replying gently, let him be. Yu Shang's current level of training was such that no one would have been able to move him but saints. Saint Ji and the others would not have wanted to exchange lives with Yu Shang, unless the situation had been really dire. If it had been Yi Futian standing outside their gates instead, there was a possibility that they might have done so. The glass saint is awake, Zhuge Mingyue said. Yi Futian was unfettered upon hearing that, with little changes in his expression seen. Well, this number 1 beauty of the eastern state sure is beautiful indeed. She trained for many years and yet still looks like a maiden. If I were to become a saint, I wonder if I will grow younger. Zhuge Mingyue chuckled and continued, so, now that the glass saint is already in the Holy Ji Palace, how about you go take her in, little brother? We'll have yet another saint in the Holy Ji Palace then. Yi Futian wore a bitter smirk. You've something against old people? Zhuge Mingyue continued, well, Lulan served you for years and you can take her as your concubine, you know. There are a good number of pretty girls in the Holy Ji Palace who have a thing for you like Mu Jiqiu. I'm sure she likes you too. Lulan Shui, who was behind Yi Futian, shuddered slightly and looked up at Zhuge Mingyue. Second sister. Yi Futian turned to look at Zhuge Mingyue, and found her second sister's eyes staring at him as well. It's been more than a year. When do you plan to move on? Your hair has gone all gray and you still behave like that all the time. How would Jieyu feel if she were to see you like this? Second sister, I understand. Yi Futian sighed. However, there was no way he could have simply let go of their relationship, which had seen more than a dozen years. Zhuge Mingyue softened up after seeing Yi Futian's expression, sighing deep down as well. She was having a hard time as well. She had been the one who brought Jieyu to the Zhuge family back then, and they had spent a lot of time together. To her, Hua Jieyu was her sister-in-law and someone like her own sister at the same time. A group of mighty ones came from above. Yi Futian frowned and looked, seeing a group of people dropping from the sky. The one who took the lead was none other than Xia Qingyun. Have you no manners, princess? Yi Futian said coldly. Chapter 10-11. That was where Yi Futian's bedchambers were, and only those he deemed the closest to him were allowed to visit directly. Even though Xia Qingyan was a princess, she still needed to get someone to send word instead of simply barging into the place. Xia Qingyan was not the sovereign of Emperor Xia's realm yet. That was where Yi Futian's bedchambers were, and only those he deemed the closest to him were allowed to visit directly. Even though Xia Qingyan was a princess, she still needed to get someone to send word instead of simply barging into the place. Xia Qingyan was not the sovereign of Emperor Xia's realm yet. Xia Qingyan took one look at him after seeing his cold eyes. This bastard is still as cocky as ever. Doesn't he know that he just returned from the gates of death? I have some matters to discuss with you. Xia Qingyan dropped to the ground and turned her eyes at everyone else, saying, "Leave us be." Zhuge Mingyue and Beiteng Xinger took one look at Xia Qingyuan before turning around and leaving. Lulan Shui left as well. Xia Qingyuan's men stood guard outside. Yi Futian did not stand up. If Xia Qingyuan had sent someone to send word, he would have greeted her standing up. Yet he saw no reason to be polite, given how rude Xia Qingyuan was. "You are really making yourself at home indeed, princess," Yi Futian said plainly. He, the master of the place, had not even said anything before Xia Qingyuan dismissed his guests like she owned the place. Xia Qingyuan did not reply. While her contact with Yi Futian had been limited, she had gotten used to Yi Futian's attitude. He was a man with extreme pride just like her. However, he was indeed qualified to be so prideful. Xia Qingyuan walked before Yi Futian and sat down, saying, "Do you not want to know why Saint Ji dared to exchange lives with you?" Yi Futian looked up. His eyes very sharp. Jieyu perished in that battle where the 7 holy lands had the Holy Ji Palace surrounded. However, if it had not been for the 9 mysterious mighty ones appearing at the end of the battle and Saint Ji making a move against him, Jieyu would not have died. He would not even have needed to reveal his imperial will to win that sacred war. No one knew why a saint had wanted to exchange lives with him. If Saint Ji had been cornered and there was no way he could have came out alive, then it would have made sense that he chose to die with Yi Futian. That was how things went with Zhou Yanwang. However, that was not the case with Saint Ji. His move went against human nature. Yi Futian knew that there probably were people of the upper worlds involved. Yi Futian kept his eyes on Xia Qingyuan, waiting for her to continue. Saint Ji had a son who was of noble plain training, one who was born between Saint Ji and one of his concubines. He did not die in the battle when the Holy Ji Palace raised Jisheng Cliffs. Both mother and son were gone. Xia Qingyuan said. "Who?" Yi Futian asked. "No one in Emperor Xia's realm has the gall to pull something like that. Do you know who found the imperial mausoleum in the first place?" Xia Qingyuan asked. "People from Emperor Li's realm," Yi Futian answered coldly. "Be it my father or Emperor Li, they have forces that answered only to them, and their descendants would have nurtured their own people. That 9 mysterious mighty ones were the people of Li Yao, the prince of Emperor Li's realm." Xia Qingyuan then continued, "Li Yao found Saint Ji and promised to take his son to Emperor Li's realm for further training. Saint Ji had no way out of it, so he did what he did as he had nothing to lose. Li Yao is the one responsible for your wife's death." Emperor Li's realm, Li Yao. Yi Futian looked unusually calm, yet the names were etched deep into his bone. It was no wonder why that fight had been such a fanfare, with all 9 of them being people at the pinnacle of the sage plane and armed with a set of divine implements. Furthermore, any holy land that acquired imperial implements agreed to compensate with some divine implements of theirs, letting the 3 holy lands of Endless Ocean decide among themselves how to distribute them. "Do you really need to kill them all?" Xia Qingyuan elaborated coldly. Yi Futian had destroyed 3 holy lands and there was no way he would let the Hall of Holy Light off. If the ones from the Endless Ocean were to be added to the list, 7 holy lands would have ended up razed. To the people of the 9 states, that would have been a great loss. But then again, her father did say that Yi Futian alone was worth more than those in throughout the 9 states. However, it was still a better option to keep more holy lands around intact. There is one nameless cemetery built in the Holy Ji Palace to commemorate those who have fallen in service to the Holy Ji Palace in the war. "Tell them what you told me instead, princess," Yi Futian replied just as coldly. "But then again, if that was an order from Emperor Xia himself, then I have had to follow." Xia Qingyuan's incredibly beautiful eyes stared at Yi Futian. He was indeed the first person who dared to talk back to her. The halberd of time and space once belonged to the Ocean King, the master of the endless ocean. Now that you've obtained it, it can be said that you've acquired the lineage of the Ocean King. What if I told you that you could become the master of the endless ocean, and have the 3 holy lands of the endless ocean serve you? Xia Qingyuan's voice remained cold, but she had nonetheless made compromises as well. Having Yi Futian become the new overlord of the endless ocean would be better than having all of the endless ocean's holy lands razed. Not enough, Yi Futian replied plainly. Any other conditions then? Xia Qingyuan asked coldly. I want the people of the 3 holy lands of endless ocean to come to the Holy Ji Palace and declare their fealty. Furthermore, I want the saints of the holy lands of the endless ocean to lead the visit to that cemetery in the Holy Ji Palace that I mentioned and make their apologies personally. Yi Futian then continued coldly, but then again, this is my personal opinion about things. I'd need to ask the people of the Holy Ji Palace themselves if they agree to such an arrangement. If they do not find it agreeable, I do not see it correct for even me, the Palace Lord of the Holy Ji Palace, to just impose my decision on them. Xia Qingyuan stared at Yi Futian and saw those deep eyes of his staring back at her without any hint of flinching at all. One final matter. Due to the matter with the Sacred War, the 9 States Forum was not held last year. As such, we'd like to have one organized and let the Holy Ji Palace of the Barren State serve as host. What do you think? Xia Qingyuan asked. No problem, Yi Futian answered without hesitation. The Barren State had been weak for many years. Even though they had now risen, that was solely at the top level of things, where the saints and the pinnacle of the sages lied. Exceptional ones among the lower levels were still in short supply. It was not something that could have been accomplished in a short span of time. Under such a background, accomplishing such a feat required the efforts of generations. There was no doubt that the 9 States Forum would have served as a very good environment to help the cultivators of the Barren State and the Holy Ji Palace train better. It was something that would have benefited the Barren State, so he saw no reason to refuse. Other than that, he had his reasons to make compromises with Xia Qingyuan and let the holy lands of the endless ocean swear fealty to him. He intended to delve into the training resources of the endless ocean's 3 holy lands, and use them to further the training of those in the Holy Ji Palace. With the help of Saint Jiang on top of all that, the Holy Ji Palace would not have fallen behind the rest of the 9 states at any level, after working at it for decades. If the 3 holy lands find my conditions agreeable and he people of the Holy Ji Palace agree to such arrangements, then the day of the 3 holy lands swearing fealty to the Holy Ji Palace shall be held on the same day, where the 9 States Forum is held, Yi Futian added. Xia Qingyuan then asked, don't you think that would be too brutal? If they have the intention to swear loyalty, then they need to show that they mean business. There's no point faking such matters after all, Yi Futian replied. Xia Qingyuan wanted to teach him a lesson very badly, seeing his calm expression. However, both the battle in the Imperial Mausoleum and that battle of the Sacred War seemed to have made it clear to her. She was no match for Yi Futian. Seeing how Hua Jieyu perished in that battle personally, she had originally come to pity Yi Futian. However, her conversation with the bastard before her stripped her of all compassion she had for him. Time? Xia Qingyuan asked. The first day of next year, Yi Futian replied. Xia Qingyuan stood up and turned around, her back facing Yi Futian, saying, if you weren't so overbearing, you would have been more approachable. Farewell, princess. Yi Futian looked up and said plainly. Xia Qingyuan clenched her fists somewhat tightly, before walking off without turning around. Zhuge Mingyue and Beitang Xing'er did not actually leave. They were simply waiting outside. They saw Xia Qingyuan walked out with a frosty expression and then said, let's go. She then took the sky and left. Zhuge Mingyue wore a puzzled look on her face. What did little brother do this time to piss Xia Qingyuan off like that? Damn, couldn't he just make less trouble for others? It would be in everyone's benefit if he were to just play nice with the princess. She is Emperor Xia's daughter after all. Lulan, go gather the lords to the Holy Sage Pavilion. We have matters to discuss, Yi Futian said. Lulan Shui was not all that far away. She acknowledged her orders and headed for the other palaces and pavilions. Yi Futian stood up and walked outside the compound. Be it the matter of the 3 holy lands of the endless ocean or that of the 9 states forum, he needed the advice and opinions from the other lords to get preparations done. He needed to ask the people of all the other palaces and pavilions to decide how to proceed with the aforementioned matters. Chapter 10:12. A woman sat quietly in St. Zhang's herb palace in the Holy Ji Palace. She was wearing elegant, light clothing, very simple and clean but still beautiful enough to make one lose their breath. The only thing lacking was the expression on her pretty face, or rather her lack of expression. It was like still water without the slightest ripple. No joy or anger could be seen on her face, and thus she looked extraordinarily lonely. A woman sat quietly in St. Zhang's herb palace in the Holy Ji Palace. She was wearing elegant, light clothing, very simple and clean but still beautiful enough to make one lose their breath. The only thing lacking was the expression on her pretty face, or rather her lack of expression. It was like still water without the slightest ripple. No joy or anger could be seen on her face, and thus she looked extraordinarily lonely. At that moment, there was the sound of footsteps as Little Butterfly approached. When she saw that calm figure, she was amazed even though she herself was a very beautiful woman. The foremost beauty in the Easter State's disposition was different than before. It was as if she was completely divorced from the world, and completely supernatural. It was as she was no longer of this world. Senior Glass Saint, the people from Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple are still outside. They won't leave, said Little Butterfly. Let them come in, said Glass Saint. Even her voice was flat and even. Little Butterfly nodded slightly then turned to leave. She called the people from Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple to come in, and then she waited outside. At that moment, a figure came over to her and called, Little Butterfly, have you come to see Glass Saint? She smiled warmly as she saw Futian walking towards her. How is she? He asked. It seems that she's not ready to rebuild Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple yet. Even though the people from there have begged her, she is still unmoved and indifferent. It's just like the Master said, after the battle between Glass Saint and the Great Zhou Sacred King when she cut the Great Zhou Sacred King with Love Destroyer, she was wounded as well. She was put in a very difficult situation. She destroyed her own emotions so she has no more feelings, said Little Butterfly. A strange look came over Futian's face. She had become emotionless? Glass Saint was obsessed with killing the Great Zhou Sacred King and destroying the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty. Now that she had achieved vengeance, she probably did not know what she should pursue anymore. If a saint had no convictions to hold on to, could they really be called a saint? There was once again the sound of footsteps. Futian looked up and saw a line of women from Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple coming out. They could not hide the look of loss in their eyes. When they saw Futian, one of them bowed and said, Lord Yi, we have troubled you for so long. This is farewell. Glass Saint is not going back with you? Asked Futian. They shook their heads. We don't know what happened to our mistress, but we will respect her choice. But we'll still think of a way to rebuild Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple. If you want, you can stay at the Holy Ji Palace to cultivate. Maybe one day Glass Saint will change her mind, said Futian. They were all shocked and looked at each other in astonishment. They were clearly moved by his offer. Things were different now. The Holy Ji Palace of today was glorious and would grow even stronger in the future. Cultivating there would be extremely advantageous for them. But when they thought of themselves as people from Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple, they felt a bit lonely. The palace was rising while Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple would become history. Perhaps their mistress would one day change her mind. We'll discuss it, one of them said. All right. Futian nodded. They all bowed and then parted. Futian walked into the courtyard. Glass Saint was still sitting there calmly like before with her back to him. He walked over to her side and stood there quietly. With his white hair and white clothes, the two of them looked like immortals. I heard you're not planning to leave the palace? Futian asked. Glass Saint sat there quietly for a while. After a while she said, I just haven't thought about where to go. Why? He turned to her and said, You don't want to kill me, do you? At the Imperial Mausoleum, Glass Saint and Zhou Jiming had been oppressed by the Great Path. Futian had been extremely flirtatious towards her. But because of Zhou Jiming, she couldn't break their alliance. She had even come to Qingzhou City to convince him to return. But now that Zhou Jiming was dead, she probably hated him. He looked at her beautiful profile. Her temperament seemed to have changed. Although she had cultivated the path of destroying love, and after removing her mask she became extremely cold, but after all, she still had the 7 emotions and 6 desires, and they could not be completely cut off. But now she seemed to truly have no emotions. There was a stir in Glass Saint's still eyes as Yi Futian said this. Maybe it was because what Yi Futian had done to her had left such a deep impression, so deep that it touched her soul, and so there was actually a faint ripple in her heart. But her face was still as cold as before. She said nothing. She turned around and seemed about to leave. "Where are you going?" asked Yi Futian. "I haven't decided," said Glass Saint. Yi Futian turned and said to her back, "Then why don't you stay in the palace for a while?" Glass Saint did not step away. She turned to look at Yi Futian, but she did not refuse his suggestion. Yi Futian sighed inwardly as he looked at her impassive face. Although he had been extremely dissatisfied with her actions in the Imperial Mausoleum, the enmity between her and Zhou Jiming, Zhang Yuchan's death, and her help in the Sacred War, no matter what her goal had been, all helped to settle his grudge against her. He no longer bore her any enmity. He even pitied her. He could feel her sorrow. Maybe it was the feeling of fellow sufferers sharing in their misery. He had paid a tragic price in the war. Glass Saint seemed to be the winner, but what had she really won? Her obsession for many years had come to an end. Zhou Jiming was dead, but Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple had been scattered. She herself had no more emotions. If her emotions had truly been destroyed, then how was she any different than a walking corpse? So Yi Futian felt a bit sad. He would rather see a Glass Saint that hated him. Did she really not even hate him? Human 7 emotions were happiness, anger, sorrow, pleasure, fear, love and malice. Had the love destroyer cut through all 7 of them? If you never decide and stay in the palace, I'll have someone build a lapis lazuli palace, said Yi Futian. He turned to leave. Glass Saint watched his retreating figure. Her eyes were still as calm as still water. The days passed, and the storm caused by the destruction of the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty and Xihua Sacred Mountain swept through the 9 states. For a long time there was no way to calm things. The cultivators from the Hall of Holy Light could not dare to go out whenever they pleased, as Yusheng from the Holy Ji Palace was on guard outside, waiting to cut down any of them who came out, so they were shut up in the hall. The 5th-ranked Holy Land in the 9 states had been suppressed to this level. This showed the power of the barren state. Xia Qingyuan sent someone to the Holy Ji Palace. This time, she did not go herself but sent someone to convey her message. The 3 great holy lands of the Endless Sea had agreed to her conditions, but they had a bottom line. Yi Futian must not have the Holy Ji Palace replace them, and they must stay in the Endless Sea, passing down their teachings from generation to generation. But they were willing to have Yi Futian become the Ocean King, and they would submit to him. This would be equivalent to keeping the 3 great holy lands. They didn't have to be scattered and hunted down. They could continue to pass on their teachings. Yi Futian would definitely leave one day. He couldn't control them forever. Thus they were willing to take a step back and compromise. The saints were willing to bow their heads. Of course they had done this unwillingly. Given the situation, if they didn't bow their heads, who could ensure that they would survive? Instead, they were willing to pay a price. Yi Futian accepted their conditions. He had never wanted to have the Holy Ji Palace replace the 3 great holy lands of the Endless Sea, instead wanting to use them to grow the palace. But it was no problem. After the 2 sides reached an agreement, the news spread throughout the 9 states. There was another uproar. Another piece of news circulated at the same time. The 9 states forum would be held on the first day of the next year. If that was all, it would not be worth the people of the 9 states' attention. But this time the 9 states forum would take place in the barren state, in the Holy Ji Palace. This news instantly caused an uproar. In less than 10 years, the Holy Ji Palace had gone from not even having the right to participate in the 9 states forum and had been shut outside, to hosting it themselves. It was like a dream. Many people thought that the fact that the 9 states forum was being held at the Holy Ji Palace symbolized their rise in the world and the fact that they could not be stopped. This 9 States Forum would certainly have a special meaning. The 10,018th year of the Divine Prefecture calendar gradually came to a close. The Holy Ji Palace became very busy. They summoned skilled laborers from the barren state to completely rebuild the palace in order to prepare for the 9 States Forum. It was not only the Holy Ji Palace that was busy, but all of the barren state was also uncharacteristically lively. All the cultivators from around the 9 states were gathering in Qingzhou City. For a time, all the eyes of the 9 states were on the Holy Ji Palace. After the events at the Imperial Mausoleum, the barren state had once again attracted the attention of the 9 states. But at that previous time, the barren state had seemed to be dispensable, and no one cared about it. But this time the barren state was an active participant. At this time, many cultivators had gathered in a famous restaurant in Qingzhou City. They were talking about the 9 States Forum. Most of them had come specifically for the forum. The palace has announced throughout the barren state that anyone who can qualify for the law battles at the 9 States Forum can enter the Holy Ji Palace to cultivate. It doesn't matter what you achieve at the 9 States Forum, you have to seize your chance to enter the palace, one of them said. I've heard that Lord Yi is heartbroken. His hair went white because he misses his wife, but now his appearance has become even more natural and unrestrained. If we get into the palace, maybe we'll have a chance to get closer to the legend of the barren state, whispered a woman. You can't be thinking of entering the palace as the wife of the palace lord, someone said with a smile. I urge you not to entertain this idea. Besides his late wife, who is there in the 9 states who could be a match for Lord Yi? The woman who had spoken had not cultivated to a high level yet. She was just fantasizing. When she heard the other criticizing her, she turned red and bowed her head. Elsewhere in the restaurant, a group of people was drinking wine in silence. One of them was a former disciple of the palace, Zhuge Xing. The rest of them were also of the Zhuge clan. Years ago the Zhuge clan had split into 2 factions. Zhuge Qingfeng's faction had stayed with the palace to fight to the death, while Zhuge Xing's faction stood on their own. Now Yi Futian stood at the peak of the barren state, and the people looked at him as a god. Everyone in the 9 states knew of him, and those under the saint level followed his orders. If someone in this restaurant had disrespected him, everyone in the restaurant would attack them. Zhuge Qingfeng's faction would definitely have a glorious future. When they thought of this, they didn't know how to feel. The people from the core of the 9 states thought that Emperor Xia must place a lot of importance on Yi Futian. From the Sacred War it could be seen that even though Emperor Xia seemed neutral, he had favored Yi Futian slightly ever since the Sacred War. With the ruler of the 9 states feeling this way, Yi Futian's future was obvious for everyone to see. The cultivators of the 3 great holy lands of the Endless Sea were no fools, and they could naturally see this. With that being the way things were, they had no choice but to bow to him. Also, any of you may use this stone wall that has been carved here for cultivating. Moreover, anyone who is not participating in the 9 States Forum can go to the palace by other roads to watch. There will be people to lead you to the palace at that time. After making this announcement, Sword Demon turned to leave. After receiving confirmation, all the people outside were excited. They had not expected that they would be able to witness such a grand occasion as the 9 States Forum in their lifetimes. This was going to be a spectacular event, and in the past the barren state did not even have the right to participate. The 10,018th year of the Divine Prefecture calendar came to an end under the eager anticipation of many people. Countless people were in Zhongzhou City for the celebrations. The 10,019th year of the Divine Prefecture calendar had finally arrived as all the 9 states watched. On that day, a sea of people stood outside the Holy Ji Palace. There were so many that they could not all be taken in at a glance. Most of them were all the cultivators who had come from around the barren state, as well as those who had joined other top forces in the barren state. All of them, even if they had previously had a grudge against Yi Futian, did not dare to not come and support the forum. Even though Yi Futian had not given any orders, and had put forth no requirements, they still did not dare to not come. Today, a single word from Yi Futian would move all of the 9 states, especially the barren state. A single word from him could change the structure of the barren state and turn a top force into nothing more than ashes. Many rumors were circulating throughout the barren state at that time. For example, after the Nine-State Forum, Yi Futian would re-establish the order of the barren state and change the existing pattern of the state. Those forces that did not go to the Holy Ji Palace to participate in the law battles all trembled in fear. Even if Yi Futian did not hold a grudge against them and did not punish them, his will would still determine their future. As they looked at the sky stairwell in front of them, many people sighed in their hearts. Not even 10 years had passed, but it seemed like a whole new era. Starting from today, the barren state had entered a new age. At this time there was an incomparably strong aura high in the sky. Everyone looked and saw a group of figures riding on dragons. But now it was happening before their eyes. At this year's Nine States Forum they would not only be able to see the legendary figures of the palace, but they could also see the most powerful figures in the Nine States with their own eyes. Almost all of the cultivators of the sages and saints ranking had come. Some people made promises to themselves, some people's blood boiled, some sighed to themselves 1,000 times. At the same time, some people seemed deeply regretful. Some examples included the Shiman family of Zhongzhou City, the Thunder Courtyard, and some of the other top forces of the barren state. They had all had the chance to join the Holy Ji Palace in their sacred war and become members of the palace. They also could have had the chance to compete with the other forces of the Nine States. But now they could only watch. After seeing Zhuge Qingfeng, Su Shang, Yu Qi, and others who were on the barren sky ranking just like them, they could only bow their heads in respect. Moreover, after the experience of fighting in a sacred war, those people's power had far surpassed their own. They might even have a chance in the future to participate in the battles of proving holiness. Was this not what they had dreamed of? And given the situation, the regretful people had no hope of entering the battles of proving holiness. What right did they have to compete with the most powerful figures of the Holy Ji Palace? They had made their mistake, now they had to live with it. Shiman Hanjiang was also among the crowd. He had once been number 1 on the law rank. Now he could only look up at the Holy Ji Palace. Going inside had become a vain hope for him. Chapter 10:14. In the land of 9 states, the cultivators of all the holy lands arrived one after another. All the saints had arrived at the palace, and those who were participating stayed in front of the stone wall, mixing into the large crowd. In the land of 9 states, the cultivators of all the holy lands arrived one after another. All the saints had arrived at the palace, and those who were participating stayed in front of the stone wall, mixing into the large crowd. At the moment above the sky, there were giant beasts such as kunpangs and black dragons that came from the air. Countless people looked up and saw a black mass in the sky, and it was a large number of cultivators approaching. It was as if everyone from all holy lands had come. The 3 holy lands of the endless ocean have arrived. Many people shuddered secretly and had already guessed who was coming. The Ocean Palace, coming to the Holy Ji Palace of Barren State to beg your pardon. The clan of the North Deep, coming to the Holy Ji Palace to beg your pardon. Celestial Cliffs, coming to beg pardon. 3 consecutive shocking voices were heard, and they were from the mouths of the masters of the 3 great holy lands to show their sincerity. This peace summit was brokered by the little princess Xia Qingyuan. They agreed to the conditions put forward by Yi Futian, and with the princess as a witness, they dared not fake it even if the thought had crossed their mind. They had to perform their duties to the utmost. Since the choice of compromise was already made, no matter what, they had to set aside their dignity for the time being. The situation was such that concessions must be made, or their holy lands would no longer exist. They had to admit defeat, and they were very clear that this was not only bowing down to Yi Futian but was in fact also bowing down to Emperor Xia. The sacred war was instigated by them, and now that they had lost, it was only natural for them to bear the price, otherwise, Emperor Xia would only favor Yi Futian. Look at Great Zhou's sacred king, who had wanted to kill Yi Futian in return, but died trying. And they had never even thought of using their own lives just to smite Yi Futian. Suddenly there was dead silence in the vast space. There was no welcoming sound from the palace. Just silence. The cultivators of the 3 holy lands landed in front of the stone walls, and many people even bowed their heads slightly and felt a mixture of emotions all at once. The 7 great holy lands laid siege upon the Holy Ji Palace and were defeated. Now this was the price they had to pay. The saints have bowed their heads. Countless people in the barren state stared at this scene, and their hearts were disquieted. Today, not only had all the saints of the 9 states come to visit, but the 3 holy lands of the endless ocean had come to ask forgiveness. A person walked forward, tall and broad like an ancient god standing upon the sky stairwell. Saint Dozhan. The barren state looked at the figure, and many suddenly showed a look of great emotion. Some even started to breathe quickly. They did not have such a strong feeling when they saw all the other saints of the 9 states. However, Dozhan was different. In the first battle of the divine path, he almost used his entire power to save the Holy Ji Palace on his own, forcibly breaking the limits of his physical body and attracting the divine catastrophe. Instead of trying to overcome the catastrophe, he used it against the cultivators of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty, and did not hesitate to torch his own life in return. He continuously breaching the battle matrices of the Great Zhou sacred dynasty until on the verge of death, forcing the Great Zhou sacred dynasty to withdraw their troops. This was also the beginning of a great era. The palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace, Yi Futian, took him to the 9 State College, where he sought medical treatment from Saint Jiang, who cured him, and he finally passed the catastrophe and became a saint. This was the living legend of the Holy Ji Palace of the barren state, a person who was destined to be recorded in the annals. How could the people of the barren state not revere and worship him? Was it merely to ask for forgiveness? Dozhan surveyed the people from the 3 holy lands of the endless ocean coldly. His voice heard loud and clear. The 3 holy lands of the endless ocean are willing to serve the palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace, Yi Futian, as the Ocean King. And from this day forward, the endless ocean will be ruled by the Ocean King, said Ocean Saint of Ocean Palace. This was the title he had dreamt about. To become the master of endless ocean. This was the reason for his title as Ocean Saint after he had become saint. But now Yi Futian would inherit the title of Ocean King. There is more, Dozhan continued. His voice was still cold and distant. All of us, when entered into the Holy Ji Palace, will repent in front of the tombs of all those from the palace who died in the battles, Saint North Deep said, although he was reluctant. The princess had ordered them and they had agreed, so no matter what happened today, they must bear all of it. Dozhan glanced at the crowd. He understood that the saint of the endless ocean was probably unwilling but had said what they said pressed by the present situation. Yi Futian had already warned him before, but it did not matter to him. Since you have named Palace Lord Yi as the Ocean King, then the command of the Ocean King is that after 9 State Forum, the 3 holy lands are to bring their laws of cultivations to the Holy Ji Palace for the Ocean King to peruse. Any objections? The cultivators of the 3 holy lands were truly feeling torn, but still they could only answer with as much conviction as they could. We have no objections. In addition, the Ocean King will often call on the cultivators of the endless ocean to cultivate at the Holy Ji Palace, to practice with the disciples of the Holy Ji Palace. Any objections? Dozhan continued. No objections, they responded. Very well then. Since the 3 holy lands of the endless ocean are sincere in their desire to belong with the Holy Ji Palace, you may enter the palace now, Dozhan said. He turned around and led the cultivators of the endless ocean into the palace, leaving countless people shocked. The 3 holy lands of the endless ocean had surrendered, and from this day forward, the new Ocean King of the endless ocean was born, and it just so happened that the halberd of time and space was in the hands of Yi Futian. Perhaps this was all fate. Yi clan of Summer State has come to pay respect to the Holy Ji Palace. Above the firmament, there was a group of brilliant figures heading for the direction of the palace. However, there was no sound that was coming out of the palace, which forced the cultivators of Yi clan to stop outside the palace. Yi clan of Summer State has come to participate in 9 State Forum. Another voice was heard, somewhat displeased. Enter. An indifferent spoke. Even the word please was omitted. The cultivators from Yi clan looked vexed, and Saint Yi was even more displeased in his heart. It seemed that Yi Futian still held a grudge about the battle at the Imperial Mausoleum. That time they had gone against Yi Futian. Later, Moon Saint had gone to persuade them not to participate in the war, and that was why they stayed on the sidelines. But even so, though Yi Futian would not deal against the Yi clan, neither would he be warm to them, so this cold attitude was not unexpected. Today, Saint Yi came in person in an attempt to ease the mood, but Yi Futian did not give much appreciation. However, today's Holy Ji Palace, relying on its own strength alone, could suppress the Yi clan with no problems. Therefore, Saint Yi could only toughen up and enter the Holy Ji Palace. After a long while, all the other holy lands came one after another. Above the sky stairwell, Sword Demon appeared there, and looked downward saying, 9-state forum now officially begins. All 9 states cultivators of the noble plane can dash through the sky stairwell. Those who successfully enter the palace through the sky stairwell may participate in the law battles. The rest of the people may enter the palace from both sides following the directions. Finally, it's starting. Countless cultivators of the noble plane who wanted to participate in the 9-state forum took a deep breath. In an instant, thousands of cultivators stepped forward and walked toward the sky stairwell of the Great Path. There, for the other states in the 9 states were held the qualification for the law battles. However, for the people of the Barren State, it was not only the admission ticket for the law battles, but it was also the sky stairwell that realized their dream of cultivating in the Holy Ji Palace. As long as they could get up there, they would also become a member of the Barren State Holy Land, the Holy Ji Palace. Standing above the palace in one glance, countless people were marching forward, covering the sky as if they could flood this holy place. The crowds who entered the palace from the sides were led all the way forward. Today's Holy Ji Palace exuded a sense of sacred majesty. On both sides there were many palace compounds. Right in front of them there was a straight path. Looking into the distance, the terrain faintly to appear getting higher and higher. Nestled within the depths of the Holy Ji Palace, there was a towering palace that was erected into the sky, ethereal and holy. As they moved forward, they were getting closer and closer to the palace, and the mighty crowd voluntarily kept quiet, as if they could feel that solemn and sacred atmosphere, as if on a pilgrimage. For the people of the Barren State, the significance of coming today was not only to watch the 9-state forum but a pilgrimage. After a long time they finally came to the end of the road, a vast expanse of land to view the battles. In the order of first come first serve, they lined up all the way to the back. In front of them there was an incomparably beautiful law battle platform that was suspended in the air. In front of the platform was the sky stairwell that led to the majestic palace located in the void. At this time, above the sky stairwell, there was the viewing stand in the shape of an ark for all the holy lands of the 9 states. There were already many cultivators from the holy lands in the 9 states sitting there. Behind them, there were cultivators arriving in succession from the void. Their bodies landed on the platform that was suspended in the air. These were those who had passed the assessment and had obtained the qualifications to participate in the battle. Looking at those who were continuously landing on the platform, some were envious. The battle of the noble plane that was to be witnessed by the saints of the 9 states was tremendously rare, possibly only once in a centennial. However, compared with those who had obtained the qualifications for the law battle, the people of 9 states were even more curious about Yi Futian, especially those from the Barren State. They all looked up to the sky and looked forward to his arrival. Time passed by bit, and there were now more and more cultivators on the battle platform, and there were more people gathering on the viewing stand out in front. The cultivators of the 3 holy lands of the endless ocean had arrived, but they were sitting at the end. In addition, the cultivators of the Yi clan were also being arranged to sit at the end. Saint Yi sat there with extreme indignity, and yet he couldn't very well leave, so he sat there with an uncomfortable exasperation. Sunlight sprinkled from the sky and landed on the beautiful law battle platform. Countless people still looked up skyward. They saw that above the sky stairwell, and in front of the magnificent palace, there finally appeared an extensive group of people walking down the steps. Among them were Saint Xia, Saint Li, Lord of Vajra region, Moon Saint, and the others. They were those cultivators who had leaned toward the side of the Holy Ji Palace in the Sacred War. Yi Futian welcomed them into the palace to chat and catch up. Countless eyes gazed at the same place. Among the congregation of people, the hearts of the people of barren state were beating with excitement, looking at the white-haired youth who stood at the top of the sky stairwell, occupying the space right in the middle. That handsome and extraordinary white-haired youth was the most legendary figure in barren state today, the palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace, Yi Futian. Next to the white-haired youth there were many others such as Sword Saint Yu Shang, Gu Donglu Yu Qi Su Shang, Zhuge Qingfeng, Yun Shang, Qin Zhuang and Sword Demon. Among these people, some of them had risen later, while some of them had already been named on the barren sky ranking, but all of them were now legends of the barren state who would be remembered by the barren state. At this moment, countless cultivators of the barren state had the urge to cry, and some people who were passionate were already in tears. In this life, to be able to lay eyes on them here was what made this life worth living. However, it seemed that there was still someone missing by the side of Palace Lord Yi. Chapter 10:15. At the Holy Ji Palace, the sunlight sprinkled on the sky stairwell. The legend of the barren state bathed in its golden glow and walked down the steps. The people of the barren state were solemn, as if in the presence of the holy. At the Holy Ji Palace, the sunlight sprinkled on the sky stairwell. The legend of the barren state bathed in its golden glow and walked down the steps. The people of the barren state were solemn, as if in the presence of the holy. Yi Futian and the others walked down, and the white-haired youth was more extraordinary in his aura. He looked at the immense crowd underneath, and said to Saint Xia, Saintly, and the rest of the people next to him, Please sit down, honorable seniors. Saint Xia, Glass Saint and the rest then sat, and Yi Futian and other people from the palace also sat in their own seats. The Holy Ji Palace in barren state was the host, so it was natural that its people were sitting in the middle. Yi Futian occupied the middle, with Yaya at the left, the village chief was sitting next to him, and Saint Zhang and Dozhan were to the right, and all the cultivators from the four great holy lands were all sitting near Yi Futian. Such a display of power let the people of the 9 states truly feel the strength of the barren state. On the side there were palace lords such as Sword Saint, Yang Shao, Sword Demon, Daozong and many others. Every one of them was a well-known figure in the barren state. In the barren state, many of their legends had circulated. All the holy lands of 9 states sat in an arc with the Xia clan on the left, the 9-state college on the right, and behind them the Vajra region, the Yu clan, and other principalities of the holy lands that sided with Yi Futian. Their positions were also toward the top, as they themselves already held high status in the 9 states. As for other holy lands, they sat according to their ranking. Since the saints were all arriving today, using the recognizing ranking for sitting, no one would have objected. The exception was the 3 holy lands of the Endless Ocean and the Yi clan sitting at the end, and the reason was apparent to the people of 9 states. In the direction of Jixia Palace, Bai Luli also arrived. Witnessing the prosperity of the barren state at this moment, his heart was equally filled with emotion and relief, and he released everything in the past to the wind. Yi Futian had not only completed the master's long-time wish, but also brought the Holy Ji Palace to a new height. Bai Luli looked up at the white-haired figure who bathed in the sunlight. His eyes took in the people of 9 state. Yi Futian said slowly, 9 State Forum is the highest stage for all the young people of the 9 states. Proud sons and daughters of all holy lands competed here to witness the true strength of the cultivators of the 9 states. Therefore, the 9 State Forum is slightly different from the past. Instead of dividing the number of people participating in the battles in the 9 states, all the people who participated in the 9 states will be mixed and redistributed. My hope was that we would see the strongest of the 9 states and not about keeping the balance of the participants of the 9 states. In the past few years, the barren state was isolated from the rest of the 9 states, and the strength of the outside world was unknown and lagged far behind the average strength of the 9 states. Even though this time the 9 State Forum is being held in the Holy Ji Palace at barren state, and perhaps the participants from barren state were the fewest with the least finalists, it doesn't matter. I only hope that people in the barren state will witness the battles of the forum as motivation for them to work harder. The great path is long and treacherous. Only the faithful will be able to see the scenery farther away. The calm voice of Yi Futian sounded in the eardrums of the people of the barren state. Many even felt their blood boiling. The road to cultivation on the great path was long and winding, and only those whose belief was firm could go far. What if the barren state lagged behind the average strength of the 9 states? Didn't Futian and these living legends bring the barren state to a new height? This time at the 9-State Forum there was no Yushang and no Huajieyu, so it was not as brilliant as the one a few years back, but it did not matter and no one would really mind. Today, the 9 States Forum took place at the Holy Ji Palace in Barren State. With the arrival of all the saints, it obviously held historical meaning. Compared to that, the reality of the 9-State Forum was not that important. This year's 9-State Forum was the grandest in 100 years. And precisely because of this, the ranking of this time's 9-State Forum was the most insignificant. After Futian finished speaking, Dozhan, who stood next to Futian, also said, "The reward for this year's 9-State Forum for the top 10 are all divine implements or holy items. I hope you will all do your best." In this mighty sacred war, the Hall of Holy Light suffered heavy losses, and 3 holy lands were eradicated. After the war, the Holy Ji Palace had obtained many divine implement and holy items as trophies. Today's Holy Ji Palace could be considered extremely wealthy, so it was not a big deal for them to put up 10 holy items as prizes, but at 9-State Forum it showed extreme sincerity. It was also a sign of respect for all the saints of the 9 states who were present today, highlighting the importance that Holy Ji Palace paid to 9-State Forum. "Announce the rules of the law battles and let's get started," Futian said with a clear voice. Instantly, Sword Demon and the sage Wanxiang stepped forward for the battle platform to preside over the 9-State Forum. Thus, the 9-State Forum hosted by the Holy Ji Palace in Barren State was kicked off. Under the witness by all the saints of the 9 states, all the proud sons and daughters of 9 states gave their best, but with great sportsmanship, so that as much as it was a great showing, it did not damage the peace between the participants. This was also the current inclination of 9 states. After the turmoil caused by the sacred war, all the saints hoped that there would be no more turbulence now. The cultivators in the barren state were undoubtedly the most enthusiastic and excited among all the participants of this time's 9-State Forum. Those cultivators from the barren state who participated in the law battles gave their all, and in the end 3 were able to enter the top 100, but ultimately none of them were able to enter the top 10. Even though the ranking was not really ideal, it was not easy for them. For this, the people of the barren state did not care much. The 9-State Forum this time took a month to come to a close. Many people in the holy lands of 9 states had left, and the cultivators of the clan left the fastest. But Futian had asked the people of the barren state to stay behind. Saint Xia and Saint Li did not rush to leave either, wanting to see what Futian had to say. The vast number of the people of the barren state did not leave, staring at Futian on the stairwell as if they wanted to stay in the palace forever. Futian got up and looked at the people of the barren state and said, "As everyone knows, our Holy Ji Palace of Barren State experienced this sacred war, and now it is finally able to stand firmly atop of all 9 states. This was the wish of the generations past of the Holy Ji Palace, but it wasn't just the Holy Ji Palace I wished to be strong, but also that the cultivators of Barren State so that they could have the best conditions for cultivation. When I was cultivating at the cottage of the East Barren Territory, this was also how my master taught me. Cultivators need to keep an open mind and a great heart, not to be self-centered, but to share the way with the world. In the past my master was like this, and so is the Holy Ji Palace, and Saint Jiang also has such a wish. I am now the palace lord, and I will fulfill the wishes of my predecessors, and make them a reality. I announce that the land of Zhongzhou City in the Barren State will establish Tingxue Palace with Su Shang as the palace lord of Tingxue Palace. In the northern territory of the Barren State will be Zhuge Academic Palace with Zhuge Qingfeng as palace lord. In the western part of the Barren State, Alchemy Palace at Alchemy City, with Yu Qi as the palace lord. In the southern part of the Barren State, Ice Palace will be established with Yun Shang was the palace lord. In the east, the Starry Palace will be established with Chen Yuan was the palace lord. The 5 palaces of the Barren State are all branches of the Holy Ji Palace. I will be sending cultivators directly from the Holy Ji Palace to the 5 palaces to share their wisdom, and distribute the spiritual resources to the people who cultivated in the Barren State. Every year, the palaces will meet with the Holy Ji Palace to exchange. Those who cultivated with hardships, good moral, and outstanding talents can choose whether to enter the Holy Ji Palace to cultivate, and those who excelled among them could even enter the holy temple and enjoy the resources of the divine path. Futian's voice was loud and clear and rang through heaven and earth, trembling in the ears of everyone in the barren state. Countless felt the flow of their blood in their veins. This was the heart of Futian, Palace Lord of Holy Ji Palace. After the Sacred War, the Holy Ji Palace suffered terrible losses, and his beloved wife died in battle. With the flame of revenge in his heart, he destroyed the Great Zhou sacred dynasty and Xihua sacred mountain on a roll. But to this day, he still cared for the people of the barren state. Yuqi Zhuge Qingfeng Sushang Yunshang Chan Yuan and others stood by Futian. They were all smiling. This was decided after they had discussed it together. Alchemist City, Tingxue House and Zhuge family would no longer exist, but would be branches of the Holy Ji Palace. It was just that from now on, instead of being forces of clans and family, they would have evangelical purposes rather than being self-centered. They were all willing to support Futian and work hard for the same goal. It was also a wonderful thing that when they had cultivated to this level, that in addition to pursuing the divine path, they could also contribute to the world. Saint Xia and Saint Li both smiled and felt relief in their hearts. Saint Li looked at Saint Jiang and released that last trace of resistance about Saint Jiang joining the Holy Ji Palace. All was well. But in the same way, among the crowds, the Shimen clan and the other branch of the Zhuge family appeared pale, as if they had fallen into the abyss. They all understood that from this day forward in the barren state, there would only be the Holy Ji Palace. They would all gradually disappear into the long river of history, and be allowed to decline with time. Futian did not take revenge against them, but this order was enough to change their destiny. Everything was over, and the barren state would have a new landscape henceforth. This 9-state forum, which was held at the Holy Ji Palace, was indeed a marker between two eras. "Thank you, Palace Lord." A voice broke through the silence of the space and pulled back everyone's thoughts. Suddenly, the same sound started to be heard everywhere. Soon this sound was heard between heaven and earth, and the sound was soaring. Under the stairwell in the vast palace, countless people bowed their heads and bowed down to Futian. There was sincere respect in their eyes. Saint Xia saw this and smiled, and said to Saint Li, who was next to him, "We should go." "Well, let's go." Saint Li nodded, and the two led their respective cultivators and left together. Futian turned and walked up the stairwell, and the people around him followed him as well, climbing up the sky stairwell step by step. Under the stairwell, countless many looked up behind him, seeing his white hair fluttering in the wind like a real immortal. 9-state forum had ended, but it was just a prelude of a new era for the barren state. Chapter 10:16. The chaotic 9 states returned to the quiet state of the past after the 9 states forum was over. The barren state was, however, incredibly busy. 5 palaces, the Alchemy Palace, the Zhuge Academic Palace, the Tingxue Palace, the Starry Palace and the Ice Palace, appeared in 5 regions of the barren state, built where Alchemy City and Crouching Dragon Mountain had been. They came to look even grander and magnificent than they had once been. The Holy Ji Palace distributed resources, and every single palace had their own divine implements and methods of attaining sainthood to train with. The chaotic 9 states returned to the quiet state of the past after the 9 states forum was over. The barren state was, however, incredibly busy. 5 palaces, the Alchemy Palace, the Zhuge Academic Palace, the Tingxue Palace, the Starry Palace and the Ice Palace, appeared in 5 regions of the barren state, built where Alchemy City and Crouching Dragon Mountain had been. They came to look even grander and magnificent than they had once been. The Holy Ji Palace distributed resources, and every single palace had their own divine implements and methods of attaining sainthood to train with. The Holy Ji Palace had also borrowed and copied the training methods from the 3 holy lands of the Endless Ocean before distributing them to the Holy Ji Palace and the 5 palaces. The same went with sage ritual implements as well. Every single palace had grown far more powerful than they had once been. Many of the figures ranked in the barren sky ranking had joined the ranks of the 5 palaces, willing to teach in the 5 palaces. Doing so would have served to further their training as well. The battle of proving holiness of the 9 states would soon be upon them, and all of them wanted a chance at that. In the past, most of the participants from the Holy Ji Palace would be reduced to cannon fodder in the battle of proving holiness, as there was no way that they would have been able to fight the cultivators from the other 8 states. However, things were different now. The sages of the Holy Ji Palace of the Barren State possessed the power to shake 7 holy lands before. If Yi Futian were to participate in the event, few would have been able to match him in the battle of proving holiness. But then again, it remained to be seen if Yi Futian would have participated at all. Some speculated that he would, while there were others who thought that Yi Futian wouldn't bother. He would have definitely attained sainthood someday with his own power, and there was no reason for him to borrow external forces to do so. Time passed and year 10020 of Divine Prefecture calendar was upon them. It was the year of the battle of proving holiness. Countless people at the pinnacle of the Sage Plain throughout the 9 states emerged from training in isolation. To most of them, they had been waiting for that day for a very long time. Many elderly cultivators who had secluded themselves from the world throughout the 9 states emerged, as well as top-notch figures of the younger generation from the past 20 years. They were the new powers and the geniuses who had rocked the 9 states. They were probably armed with powers comparable to that of their elders. No one had certainty of anything. Mighty ones gathered at the Holy Sage Pavilion of the Holy Ji Palace. Yuqi, Zhuge Qingfeng, Yunshang, Sushang and many others came. They were all about to participate in the upcoming battle of proving holiness. They were of inadequate powers 20 years ago, so much so that even the previous palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace sustained severe injuries from that event. 20 years later, all of the cultivators of the Barren State were more than capable of competing in the battle of proving holiness and showing what they were made of. Yusheng walked up. Yusheng's current bearing looked completely different from how it was when he had first joined the Holy Ji Palace. He had once exuded wild, unrestrained power with just one look. While he still exuded power with his large, stout frame, his bearing had gotten more composed and internalized. His eyes were deep and emanated powerful pressure. Even sages at the pinnacle of their training would have felt vague pressure just by standing before him. Yusheng had broken into the mid-level Archmage plane, and was simply one step away from the final plane of the Sage Plains. The Sword Saint, Gudong Lu Zhuge Mingyue, and the others came from different directions and gathered around. "Where is the palace lord?" Sage Daozong asked. "He is not participating in the battle of proving holiness." "Let's go." Everyone nodded and none of them found his decision to be peculiar. Yi Futian's talents were such that he truly did not need to become a saint through the event. Furthermore, Yi Futian deemed his current plane inadequate, requiring years to temper his mind before he was ready. As such, the event was of little meaning to Yi Futian himself. As for the safety of the ones from the Holy Ji Palace, their current lineup with Yusheng the Sword Saint Gudong Lu, and the others going with them, none of the Holy Lands would be much of a match for them. There was no doubt that the current powers of Yusheng, the Sword Saint, and the others stood at the pinnacle of the Sage Plain. "That guy is slacking off again," Zhuge Mingyue mumbled. Yi Futian had been gone for a long time. When the 9 States Forum was over, he went on a pilgrimage on his own. Or perhaps he simply wanted to travel the 9 states. The massive lineup from the Holy Ji Palace was frightening. Top figures gathered from throughout the 9 states in that time. It was a battle of proving holiness hosted by Emperor Xia himself. Many wondered how many saints would emerge. However, none of that seemed to have anything to do with Yi Futian. He was at the vast endless ocean, which was located at the Ocean State, the furthest state away from the Barren State. A lone boat was floating on the vast, unending seas. There was a figure lying down quietly on the boat, swaying with the waves, thinking the sky to be his bed and the sea as his blanket. A dark golden huge bird circled above him in the blue skies. The bird was having a good time as well. There were powerful sea monsters emerging from the seas every now and then. The dark golden huge bird would then dive and tear them to shreds with its claws. None of the powerful sea monsters thought that a mutated black-winged condor possessed such terrifying powers. A king of a certain region of the seas went up to them. The monsters were easily killed. The boat continued to sway in the waves. The figure dressed in white seemed to have fallen asleep, forgetting everything about the world, and even forgetting what year it was. Time passed day after day, and the figure dressed in white seemed to be in an eternal slumber where he would never wake. A terrifying storm was upon them. A frightening whirlpool of lightning appeared before them. The light of darkness swallowed everything as towering waves rushed. That boat continued to sway in the storm, tossing about in the huge waves, yet that figure seemed to have felt nothing at all. He remained lying down and his body was tossed around alongside the boat. Terrifying lightning shot for his body and hit it, yet he continued to seem to feel nothing. Not even the boat was destroyed in that terrifying storm. It simply continued to toss in the storm. The huge bird continued to fly high in the air amidst the dark storm as if it would never tire. The boat was swallowed by the waves, moving alongside them. Everything calmed several days later. The boat finally stopped after some time, blocked by a huge piece of rock. He had arrived at an uninhabited island. The black-winged condor, flying in the air, dropped onto a huge rock and took a look at the young man on the boat. The sun shone on him and it was getting hot. The gray-haired young man finally opened his eyes slowly by then. He got used to the sunlight for a bit before sitting up. His hair was a mess and he had grown a beard. It was obvious that he had not been grooming himself for quite some time. The young man was none other than Futian. He settled the Holy Ji Palace's affairs after the 9 states forum before venturing out into the 3 holy lands of the Endless Ocean. He observed the training methods of the Endless Ocean and developed his own understanding, so he brought the black-winged condor with him and drifted at sea afterwards. He spent his days either training or simply let himself drift at sea. Year 10020 of the Divine Prefecture calendar, Futian murmured. He and the black-winged condor's mind was connected, so he was still able to keep track of time nonetheless. The battle of proving holiness of the 9 states should have begun by now then. However, he was not in the least bit worried. With Yushang, his eldest brother, and the others around, it did not matter if he participated in the event or not. Of all the figures who were at the front of the barren sky ranking all those years ago, only his teacher, Dozhan, had been able to attain sainthood. As the participants from the Holy Ji Palace had experienced the sacred war firsthand, he wondered how many among them would be able to break into a new plane. The state of mind of Yuqi, Zhuge Qingfeng, and the others should have all undergone changes after the sacred war. Their training should have been rock solid as well. Furthermore, there were several saints in the Holy Ji Palace whom they would have been able to learn from at any time. His body slowly rose to the air as he gazed at the island before him. He extended his hand and a halberd materialized. Formless current of rules coursed around Futian, which he felt to be like wind and water, with no still form. Boom! Wind blew and Futian disappeared from where he stood. The black-winged condor's eyes were incredibly sharp, yet it was incapable of tracking him at all. It turned to look at that island and found a hole on it. Futian's body had penetrated the island right away, appearing on the other side. The power of space rules vibrated and Futian's silhouette returned to that spot where he stood before, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. The first move, I shall call it the extreme shadow, Futian mumbled to himself. He then owned the divine implement that ranked 3rd on the divine implement ranking, the halberd of space and time, so he naturally had to bring out its greatest power. That was the reason why he had visited the 3 holy lands of Ocean State. He was combining the methods he learned from the cultivators of the 3 holy lands, with his own realizations and developments. His time spent adrift at sea allowed him to hone a mature way of the halberd, which belonged to him alone. The light of calamity shone on his body as soon as he finished speaking. The light of the rules coursed around the halberd in his hand. Devastating force seemed to emanate from his body. The second move, annihilation. The halberd in his hand was thrust like before at lightning speed as soon as he finished talking. However, the devastating light of calamity went on to shroud the entire island instead. At the very next moment, the entire island began to crumble. It was reduced to countless pieces of rocks. Futian's body spun in flight. He gathered devastating force about his body with the help from the speed of extreme shadow, as if that terrifying waves were about to bring down the sky. In that moment, space-time seemed to have grinded to a halt. The falling rocks were slowed considerably. Futian turned his eyes forward and thrust the halberd slowly. Third move, unending void. The space around them became extremely oppressive, as if the flow of space-time stopped altogether. Yet a devastating force remained bearing down on them. The halberd was fully extended, and within just an instant, the rocks were shattered in an instant, reduced to a powdery dust. Futian did not stop with the movements on his hands. The dust was blown away by the wind in that oppressive space. There was no longer an island before him. Futian looked pleased with himself. His time spent training all that while was not wasted after all. The halberd disappeared and everything was blown away by the wind. I have gained the halberd of time and space, nothingness, and I have created moves based on the movesets of the Ocean King and my own training. So I shall name the art after the weapon nothingness. The black-winged condor swooped down and Futian leapt onto the bird with a single step. A man and a beast were flying high up in the blue skies with the ocean beneath. The battle of proving holiness ended several months later and 12 saints emerged from the event, breaking the record of the past century. 5 saints emerged from the Holy Ji Palace, shaking the entire 9 states. Their states of mind became increasingly whole and flawless after experiencing the sacred war. Yushang, the sword saint, and the others were able to get their hands on some encounters that would further their journey to sainthood, in the battlefield of the Battle of Proving Holiness, which enabled the older generations of the Holy Ji Palace to truly get their hands on the key factors of becoming saints. Thus, the 5 saints from the barren state emerged. Many mighty ones from the other holy lands cursed the Holy Ji Palace after the event, for hoarding all sainthood resources to themselves, sharing between those who hailed from the barren state. All of the other holy lands of the 9 states were bullied. It was especially so in the case of Yushang, who happened to irk them the most. But then again, they had only grumbled and did not truly hold grudges against the Holy Ji Palace. The ones from the barren state had indeed brought overwhelming power onto the others in that year's battle of proving holiness after all. But then again, all of them had been merciful enough to go on to kill their opponents. Killing was common in the past battle of proving holiness. Furthermore, none of the holy lands would have held grudges against anyone. It was an unwritten rule. The opportunity to sainthood was destined to be one filled with blood and gore. If one chose to be a part of it, one had to be ready to fight with blood on their hands. The lineup from the Holy Ji Palace that time was truly invincible, and the others had nothing to say about them. The emergence of the 5 saints had actually robbed the opportunities of attaining sainthood from other top-notch figures from other holy lands. The reason why the barren state had not been able to have even one saint emerge in their midst probably had to do with some being unstable in mind or plane level. But that was not to say that it was the case for every single participant of theirs. The previous palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace, Chunyang, actually had stable foundations for becoming a saint, yet he was unable to get his hands on such opportunities and was unable to make that one key step. He had even acquired irreparable injuries from the battle of proving holiness. The opportunities for sainthood had been taken by and shared among the other holy lands of the 9 states. It was finally the time for the Holy Ji Palace of the barren state to reign supreme. When news of 5 saints emerging in the battle of proving holiness spread throughout the 9 states, countless flocked to the 5 major palaces of the Holy Ji Palace, wanting to train within the palaces. 4 of the 5 palaces came to have a new saint among them as lords, making all of the palaces true holy lands. It was indeed an auspicious occasion like no other. The crouching dragon mountain of the barren state, which housed the Zhuge family, had transformed into the Zhuge Academic Palace. Countless went up the mountain and came before the Zhuge Academic Palace, wanting to enroll and train within the palace. Among those people there was a huge group coming before the Academic Palace. They said, "We're of the Zhuge family in the past, and we would like to study in the Academic Palace." Their leader was named Zhuge Ji, who was one of the leaders of the branch. However, Zhuge Ji looked incredibly aged at the moment. He cupped his fists even when facing the guards of the Zhuge Academic Palace. The people of the Zhuge family followed the palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace to carve a new era of glory and prosperity. The clan leader of the Zhuge family, Zhuge Qingfeng, is now a saint and is on his way to visit Emperor Xia. So please do come again. The people of the clan are all studying within the Academic Palace and we have never heard of other branches of the family, A student outside the palace turned to look at Zhuge Ji and said plainly, "There were two branches of the Zhuge family, the clan leader being of one branch and we of the other. We truly are the people of the Zhuge family." Zhuge Ji was not angry and continued to explain. "Since the family has split into two branches, what are you people doing here?" The youth asked coldly. It was apparent that they knew of the history pertaining to the matter. "We intend to return to the family properly. We shall offer our apologies when the clan leader returns," Zhuge Ji said. "Well, you people just keep waiting outside then." The youth sounded rather disdainful. They had abandoned the clan leader when the family was in trouble all those years ago, and had formed their own branch to save their own skin. With the Holy Ji Palace now getting glorious and Zhuge Qingfeng becoming a saint, they wanted to come back and reap the benefits. If you people think that this is how things in the world work, think again. If I were Zhuge Qingfeng, I'd tell you people get the hell out of my face. "We shall wait outside then," Zhuge Ji said. The group sat somewhere not far away from the academic palace. Zhuge Xing was among the group. He lowered his head and said nothing. All of the others looked dejected. Sainthood, eh? While they had been shocked by the achievements of the barren state at the Nine States Forum all those years ago, they still had no intention of returning. However, their former clan leader, Zhuge Qingfeng, had become a saint. It was the saint in the legends. If Zhuge Qingfeng was able to look after them in their training, some among their younger generations might have been able to grasp such opportunities as well. The shock of 5 saints emerging from the Holy Ji Palace rocked not only them. "Zhuge Ji, there is only the Zhuge Academic Palace on the Crouching Dragon Mountain now, and the Zhuge family is no more. There is no way the clan leader will let you people study within the palace due to what did in the past. The Academic Palace is a branch of the Holy Ji Palace after all, and the Holy Ji Palace won't bother with people who forfeited honor and trust for their own benefit like you people. It's best that you just get off the mountain." A voice was heard in the Academic Palace. It was from an old man of the Zhuge family. Zhuge Ji shuddered slightly hearing his words. He looked in that direction and finally realized that there was no hope for them. He stood up and took a good look at the Zhuge Academic Palace on the Crouching Dragon Mountain, before kneeling on the ground and bowing as if he was expressing all the pain and suffering in his heart. Zhuge Ji stood up and then said, "It's best that you all leave. There will only be the Zhuge Academic Palace from here on out." He knew that there was no hope for their branch. No one would have bothered with them and the world would only know the Zhuge Academic Palace of the Crouching Dragon Mountain, which was helmed by the leader of what was once the Zhuge family, Zhuge Qingfeng, who had attained sainthood. Zhuge Ji also knew that the ones from Zhuge Qingfeng's branch would become the symbol of the Academic Palace, as Zhuge Qingfeng, who had become a saint, would be the gleaming symbol of the Academic Palace. The people of the Zhuge family would live better lives than before with him around. Furthermore, Zhuge Qingfeng had his daughter, Zhuge Mingyue, and his son-in-law Gu Donglü by his side. They both were brothers and sisters in training to Yi Futian, the palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace. A group of people was seen standing on the golden steps before the main mountain where the Holy Sage Pavilion was housed in the Holy Ji Palace. The one who took the lead, who was dressed in white and had gray hair, was none other than Yi Futian. Yu Shang the sword saint, Qin Zhuang, Gu Donglü and the others were at his side. They all looked at the sky and were seemingly waiting to receive someone. The presence of saintly might in the sky became increasingly clear as they neared the Holy Ji Palace. A group of people was within sight, and they were none other than Yu Qi, Zhuge Qingfeng and the others. A beaming smile was seen in Yi Futian's eyes. Countless figures from the Holy Ji Palace took to their sky and received the saints who had returned, saying loudly, "Welcome home, saints." The voice reverberated throughout the heavens, and there were no words to describe how excited the people of the Holy Ji Palace were at the moment. The 5 saints walked up to Yi Futian. Their bearing changed and they felt more surreal. Beaming smiles were seen from the eyes of all 5 of them, who then bowed and said, "Palace Lord." It was a surreal scene to have 5 saints bowing to the Palace Lord. Many of the Holy Ji Palace looked in their direction, and there were some with tears in their eyes. It was respect that Yi Futian truly deserved. Yi Futian's eyes reddened somewhat and he felt something welling up deep down. He looked at the 5 figures he was so familiar with and bowed while saying, "Good work, everyone. It was a line to express his gratitude for all they had done for him, and for the Holy Ji Palace. They spent the past years threading the line between life and death, and they have finally attained sainthood. They truly deserved it indeed. Yi Futian walked up and opened his arms. Hugging Yu Qi, he then hugged Zhuge Qingfeng, Su Shang, Yuan Hong and Yu Shang. They put the fates of the Zhuge family, the Alchemy City, the Ice Temple, the Golden Great Apes, and the Tingxue House on the line and followed him to war. They finally managed to attain sainthood. It was a pity that Huang Yi of the sovereign family had perished. There would have been 6 saints emerging. Palace Lord, we have good news for you. Yu Qi looked at Yi Futian and said, "What news?" Yi Futian smiled and asked. The best news there was at the moment to him was seeing them return. Princess Xia Qingyuan asked us to bring word to you when we were there to meet Emperor Xia. She looked into the places that she had brought the people of the 9 states on pilgrimages before, and the princess claimed that there was a chance that your wife lived. Yu Qi looked at Yi Futian and said. Yi Futian felt his body shuddering violently and his heart racing. Is there more? Yi Futian inquired with a shuddering voice. Is it true that Jiyu could still be alive? The princess didn't say much. I'm guessing that what she meant by all that was for you to ask her personally up in the upper worlds. Su Shang smiled and said to Yi Futian. Xia Qingyuan. Yi Futian's heart continued to race and he felt like beating her to a pulp. He looked at the sky and wanted to head there right there and then. Futian, get the matters of the Holy Ji Palace settled first. Zhuge Qingfeng did not address him as Palace Lord, but had instead addressed him by name. He knew that the day for Yi Futian to leave was near. He was too good to stay behind in the 9 states. Chapter 10:18. Yi Futian naturally knew what Zhuge Qingfeng meant. Although as far as he was concerned the upper and lower worlds were connected, this was not an obstacle for him. Yi Futian naturally knew what Zhuge Qingfeng meant. Although as far as he was concerned the upper and lower worlds were connected, this was not an obstacle for him. The 9 states was no longer a suitable place for him to cultivate. In the future he would have to often cultivate in the upper worlds. He would probably have very little time to return to the 9 states. He would have to leave the palace's affairs to others to handle. Uncle, you have now started on the divine path. The barren state is free from danger now, and 5 palaces stand in its 5 domains to preach the way of cultivation. I have left the master in charge of the Holy Ji Palace, with Grandfather Ape to assist him. There are also several palace lords garrisoned there. It doesn't matter if I'm there or not, said Yi Futian with a smile. 5 saints had come into the world. Today, the Holy Ji Palace was at the height of its power. Everyone smiled and shook their heads. Palace Lord Yi Futian had always been a hands-off leader. He was the symbol of the palace, a totemic figure for them. But the palace's affairs were left to others to handle, and Yi Futian rarely took an active role in its day-to-day affairs. Who are you planning to bring with you this time? Asked Yu Qi. Will see who's willing to come, answered Yi Futian. You have us garrisoned here, but you also need some saints by your side. Yu Qi was a little uneasy. The upper realms were much stronger and more responsible than the 9 states. Within the 9 states, Yi Futian was the lord of one of the holy lands of the barren state. There everyone had to abide by certain rules, but in the upper realms it was different. Moreover, there were so many cultivators in the upper realms. Many of the top holy lands had more than a few saints. Given that, if Yi Futian only brought a few sages with him, that would be cause for concern. Saint Jiang is naturally not going. He will stay in the palace and continue to stick to his beliefs. It may be a long time. I will go ask Yaya, said Yi Futian. Everyone nodded. If Yaya went with him they could relax a little. After all, Yaya was the inheritor of the Sword Saint of the Void. Not only was she already very strong, she would continue to grow stronger and reach her former peak. Even in the upper realms there were few rivals for her. In the past the Sword Saint of the Void had been without equal in the 9 states, and his name had shaken both realms. Yi Futian went to where Yaya was staying. He seemed a bit anxious. After all, after hearing the news about Jeyu he naturally wanted to go faster. However, he would not be that safe in the upper realms. At Jiutian Temple he had defeated the Juing Sword Saint's cherished disciple Pei Qianying, and his opponent had been a cultivator of Lihan Heaven. That had been witnessed by Xia Qingyuan, so no one dared to move against him. But if he spent a long time cultivating in the upper worlds, he did not know what would happen. When Yi Futian came to see Yaya, her eyes were closed in cultivation. The village chief had come with him. She opened her eyes and stared deeply at him. Complicated emotions played across her face. The memories of cultivating in both worlds melded together. Souls mingled, influencing each other. Before she had transformed, everything that had happened in Tombkeeper Village had shocked her soul greatly. These events had also branded Yi Futian's soul. Even though she was now the Sword Saint of the Void, the memories could not be erased. "I'm going to the upper realms to cultivate," said Yi Futian. Yaya stared at him and said nothing. Seeing her cold expression, Yi Futian smiled. "Take care of yourself, ya." On saying this, he turned to leave. In the end, he did not say what he had come to say. His friendship towards her had already been repaid. She had helped him break the Great Zhou Sacred Dynasty and kill the Great Zhou Sacred King. He still thought of her as a sister, but she was different than before. She was now guided by the will of the Sword Saint of the Void, and he had no right to ask her for anything. As for the village chief, he would naturally follow Yaya. After he left, Yi Futian thought for a while. Someone else came to mind, someone who might be suitable for him to choose. Yi Futian came to Lapis Lazuli Palace and came across Glass Saint still standing there in deep meditation. She seemed detached from the world. As she stood there like that, her whole aura seemed non-existent. "Have you decided where to go?" asked Yi Futian. Glass Saint looked over at him. Her beautiful face held a cold and lonely expression, like a winter's moon. There was not a trace of emotion. "If not, why don't you come with me to the upper realms? Maybe you'll find a path for yourself there," he said to her. She looked at him in the same way for a while, then said fine. She did not vacillate at all, agreeing with him directly. This made a strange look come over Yi Futian's face. He looked long and hard at Glass Saint. He had no way to know what she was thinking. Nowadays she kept a distance between her and everyone else, making her cold and beautiful. "I'll let you know when we're leaving." Yi Futian did not say too much, leaving her with that one last sentence. Afterwards, Yi Futian called together the various palace lords to confirm a few matters dealing with the palace's resources and the requirements of the core disciples. At the same time, he confirmed who would be coming with him. This time the older generation would not go, especially those who had been with him all along. 3 days later, many cultivators from the palace came to the main stairway to Holy Sage Pavilion. They knew that Lord Yi Futian was going to the upper realms to cultivate. Although he could come back whenever he wanted, he still would not come for a long time. He would keep his status as Palace Lord of the Holy Ji Palace, since he could not be replaced. After all, in the 9 states Yi Futian's name was still the symbol of the barren state. One day, when the Holy Ji Palace stood at the peak of the 9 states, he could pass down the title. Yi Futian stood upon the steps. All the cultivators of the palace had come to see him off. Beside him were those who would go with him. Among them, the cottage disciples were obviously there. This time Shui Yi was not going, but would stay in the barren state instead. Little Grass was still young, and he planned to accompany her until she grew up. After all, they had no foundation in the upper realms. If Yi Futian and the others could establish a stable foundation in the upper realms, he may bring Little Grass there sometime in the future. Beiteng Xinger would go with them. She had not cultivated to a high level, but she always followed second sister. When her master had brought her back to the cottage, third brother had gotten revenge for her, and second sister had taken care of her as she grew up. Thus she was closest to Zhuge Mingyue and Gu Donglu. She had spent the past few years with the Zhuge clan. She would go wherever they went. As for Sword Saint Zhuge Mingyue, Gu Donglu, Luofan and Yi Shaoshi, nothing more need be said. Besides the people from the cottage, Yu Shang, Yu Wuchen, Huang Zhouge, Yuanzhan, Suke, Zui Qianqiu, Phoenix, Yun Shuisheng, and Lulan Shui were all naturally going. The people from the older generation would not go, but their juniors would all follow Yi Futian from birth until death. The road ahead might be dangerous, but it would be full of opportunity. They had all had the opportunity to prove their holiness. Following Yi Futian, their juniors would never have a chance to go farther. Don't leave me too far behind, said Shui Yi with a smile. Little Grass pulled on Yi Futian's sleeve. Don't forget to come and see me, Uncle Yi. Of course. You be good now, Little Grass. Yi Futian patted the little girl's head. Little Grass nodded. I'm ready, brother. When do we leave? Came a voice. Yi Futian looked up and saw a slender figure walking over, her body full of the vigor of youth. It was Long Linger. When did I say I was bringing you? Yi Futian was stunned. Is there something wrong with me? You don't care about me anymore. Long Linger's eyes turned red. Her acting made everyone stare at her with mouth and eyes wide open. But Yi Futian did not blame her. This girl had been a little devil ever since she was a child. What do Aunt and Uncle Long have to say about this? Yi Futian asked dumbfoundedly. That means you agree. Long Linger suddenly smiled. She pulled Yi Futian's arm and looked back at Long Ao and Mrs. Long, saying, You see, Mother and Father? Brother Futian agreed. You said that if he agreed you had no objections. Yi Futian stared at her dumbfounded. Mrs. Long shook her head and smiled ruefully. Futian, I must trouble you to look after this girl. All right. Yi Futian did not know whether to laugh or cry. This girl was a menace. Everyone came to see them off one by one. Glass Saint came as well and stood there quietly. Everyone glanced at the beautiful saint. She was completely different than before. Her character had transformed. Yi Futian swept his gaze over everyone, then slowly rose into the sky. Let's go, he said, and they all set out. Farewell, Palace Lord. Everyone bowed as they called this out. Their voices reverberated between heaven and earth. They looked up and watched Yi Futian leave. Yi Futian rose up into the sky, but he seemed to sense something. He was stunned when he saw what was in front of them. He saw a huge floating sword coming towards them. A woman stood upon it, her long hair flowing in the wind. The village chief stood calmly behind her. Besides them were also Qin Zhuang and Ying. The village chief smiled at Yi Futian, and he and the others climbed aboard the sword. The sword flew off into the distance. 3 saints were with him, as well as forces who were unmatched below the saint level. Even in the upper realms this battle array would form a saint-level force. The guardians of the sky stairwell roundly berated those who had come from the lower realm. When they first saw this group of different level cultivators coming up the sky stairwell at the same time, the weak among them did not even dare to act against them. Helping them along was simply against the rules. But what could they say? The sage army that guarded Heaven's Gate was swept through, and they could not stop them. A group of figures climbed up the sky stairwell, still cursing the group of bastards who was rushing up. Commander, should we send a report? One of them did not want to accept this and wished to complain. Go do it yourself. The commander was the same one as last time. He replied indifferently. Lodge a complaint? Besides the fact that he would lose face by doing this, Yi Futian's trip to the upper realm had been suggested by the higher-ups. What was there to complain about? Chapter 10:19. After arriving in the upper worlds, Yi Futian and the others found an inn to stay at. After arriving in the upper worlds, Yi Futian and the others found an inn to stay at. The upper worlds and the lower world were different. Although the upper worlds were vast, the population was very closely crowded together, and there were endless grand palaces located there. After settling in, Yi Futian and the village chief went over to Emperor Xia's palace. The news about Jieyu had been hanging in his mind for the past few days, and now that the palace's affairs had been properly arranged, the first thing he would do while in the upper worlds was go see Xia Qing'an. The others all took the time to stroll around and become familiar with Emperor Xia's realm, and at the same time learn about the distribution of the top forces in the upper worlds, so they could form a complete map of them. But what Yi Futian did not know was that from the first moment when they had entered the inn they were staying at, they were already being watched. In Emperor Xia's realm there was a grand community of palaces that an extremely sharp willpower emanated from. This was Jueying Palace, the place where the Jueying Sword Saint cultivated. At that moment, The Jueying sword saint was sitting upright in the middle of a giant diagram cultivating. Invisible sword wheels flowed all around him. He opened his eyes and asked, "What is it?" "My lord, someone from Tianji Pavilion is here, saying he has news of Yi Futian," said the person bowing in front of him. A sword will flashed in the Jueying sword saint's eyes. "Show him in." His expression was cold. Ever since Pei Qianying's defeat, he had paid close attention to Yi Futian's movements. But the 9 states were directly governed by Emperor Xia, and he set the rules there. The Jueying sword saint did not dare do anything rash. But his most cherished disciple had been destroyed right in front of his face. How could he forget that? These days his sword was unstable, and often wavered, and he was getting tired of it. Thus he had paid Tianji Pavilion to inquire after news of Yi Futian. Tianji Pavilion did not originally worry about the affairs of the lower world because it was not worth it. No one ever asked them to pay attention to them, and so there was no profit in it for them. Thus they would not do it. But the Jueying sword saint had paid them a lot, and so they had personally sent someone to the lower world to observe the movements down there. They knew everything that happened in the lower worlds. Soon, a figure in a white robe embroidered with 2 fish representing yin and yang appeared. He squinted at the Jueying sword saint and then bowed, saying, "Greetings, Senior Jueying sword saint." The Jueying sword saint continued to sit there, and said, "Get to the point. Yi Futian has arrived in the upper worlds along with many of the cultivators from the Holy Ji Palace. There are 3 saints among them, including Yaya, the sword servant of the sword saint of the void who may have inherited his position. You have seen her before. There is also the Lord of Lapis Lazuli Holy Temple. Besides them, there are many sages who are very powerful. Almost all of those who went to the trials with Xia Qingyuan are there. This group made it up the sky stairwell into the upper worlds." The man from Tianji Pavilion smiled slightly as he said this. His report was very detailed. He had investigated those who had come very thoroughly. The Jueying sword saint's brow tightened suddenly. So there were 3 saints with him, including the heir of the sword saint of the void. He had no way of shaking such a powerful battle array. "Where are they now?" asked the Jueying sword saint. "They've taken up residence at an inn. You may not have heard, but Yi Futian has gone to Emperor Xia's palace with one of the sword saint of the void sword servants, probably to pay his respects." "As for the real reason for his visit, we don't know yet, but we will find out as soon as possible," continued the man. The Jueying sword saint nodded as he listened to his visitor continue. "There is one more thing I must remind you of. Yi Futian's performance in the sacred war in the 9 states was outstanding, and it is being said that there is no one who can match him below the saint level, and in terms of combat prowess he is said to be without rival. Emperor Xia is probably already paying attention to him, and as far as we know, Princess Xia Qingyuan has paid a visit to the Holy Ji Palace." The Jueying sword saint frowned. Yi Futian was a palace lord of a palace in the lower world, a vassal of Emperor Xia. If what his visitor said was true and Yi Futian had indeed attracted Emperor Xia's attention, then if he killed him it would displease the emperor. But many cultivators from the Holy Ji Palace had come. Perhaps he could start with them and find out Emperor Xia's attitude that way? "Father," came a voice. He looked and saw Pei Qianying coming towards him. He no longer had the same temperament that he'd had before. His hair was messy and his eyes were hazy. After his life spirit had been destroyed, his path of cultivation had been interrupted. Everyone looked at each other coldly. His former fellow disciples of the Lihan heaven looked at him, and saw that his eyes were full of only sorrow. He had lost the right to cultivate with them. Even though he was a member of the Jueying sword saint's family, you could see in his eyes that things were different now. Once everyone had worshipped and respected him, but now all that was left was contempt and pity. "I want him to die." Pei Qianying's voice was full of poison. The Jueying sword saint looked at Pei Qianying with displeasure, but he did not say anything. He only sighed. He had after all once been his most cherished son. He could understand his pain. "Come with me to Lihan heaven," he said. Pei Qianying saw his father's intention at once. He nodded and said, "All right." The Lihan Sword Palace in Lihan Heaven was the foremost holy land dedicated to swordsmanship in Emperor Xia's realm. Its current master was Emperor Xia's foremost sword saint, the most powerful swordsman. His fame was not limited to Emperor Xia's realm. From this it could be seen how high a position Lihan Heaven occupied in Emperor Xia's realm. Lihan Heaven was like a fairyland. Clouds drifted by this place that looked like a home for immortals. At that moment there was a saint cultivating in front of the palace. Pei Qianying knelt on the ground and kowtowed, weeping bitterly. In front of him was a man with an incredibly swift and sturdy aura about him. He was clearly also a saint. I have always practiced hard in order to strive for glory to repay the debt of gratitude I have for my master. No matter where I was, I could always turn to you for guidance in my swordsmanship. Now my cultivation has been ruined, and I am no longer worthy to study under you. I did not dare to taint your vision, master, and so I have not come to visit you these past few years. I hope that you can forgive me. Pei Qianying's voice was sincere. In the past he would not have been able to do this, but now honor and dignity were worthless for him. All he wanted was revenge. Rise and speak, said Pei Qianying's master. But Pei Qianying stayed bowing. He said, I am ashamed. I have come to you because I heard that the man who did this to me has come to the upper worlds. I was defeated in that battle at Zhoutian Temple. I was weaker than him, so there was no dignity in me bringing up this matter, and even less dignity in asking you to deal with it. But because of this battle I have affected the reputation of Lihan Heaven. I was humiliated in front of a crowd, and my life spirit was destroyed. Many people have been talking about this. I hope to one day see a cultivator from Lihan Heaven crush Yi Futian and wipe away the shame that I have caused. After saying this, he touched his head to the floor again and said, I have no power. I cannot wipe away my own shame. Please forgive me, master. The man in front of him looked at him. Although Pei Qianying's voice was sincere, and everything he said seemed to be for the benefit of Lihan Heaven's reputation, he also knew that Pei Qianying was seeking revenge. But that was understandable. What level has he cultivated to? He is an upper-level sage. This man considers everyone to be beneath his notice, and boasts that he has no rivals below the saint level. He is called the foremost figure in the 9 states who is not a saint. His combat ability is impressive. None in the 9 states can match it. The people of the lower world say that even in Emperor Xia's realm there is no one below the saint level who can beat him, said Pei Qianying as he looked up at his master. The youths on both sides of him frowned and gazed at Pei Qianying coldly. There was a little bit of hatred in their eyes. Pei Qianying had once been the star of Lihan Heaven, and had entered Zhoutian Temple. Now he had abandoned all dignity just for a chance at revenge. He was deliberately provoking them, trying to make them take action. Feng Xiao and Mo Li have been to the lower world. They were there at the Imperial Mausoleum. Is this the person who won Ren Huang's inheritance for his holy land? Asked an elder. Yes. He possesses an extremely powerful divine implement, said to be number 3 on the divine implements ranking of the 9 states. He was surrounded, and yet he managed to fight his way out of an encirclement of top sages all by himself, answered someone beside him. The one who stole Ren Huang's sword will, Yi Wuqian, and the one that received Ren Huang's inheritance have come with Yi Futian to the upper worlds, said Pei Qianying. The elder looked at Pei Qianying, then turned to the man beside him and said, since he was defeated at Zhoutian Temple, let's do this according to Zhoutian Temple's rules. When he heard these words, Pei Qianying clenched his fists and bowed to the floor again. The Zhuiying sword saint said nothing, standing there quietly all along. When he saw Pei Qianying bowing there, he sighed to himself. However, he was giving up his dignity for the sake of revenge. He knew that no matter who won and who lost, the ending was already determined the moment that Lihan Heaven decided to act. Oh! Yi Futian did not know that he had been watched ever since he had set foot in the upper worlds. Of course, he knew that the Zhuiying sword saint and Lihan Heaven would send people against him. That was why he had brought Yaya and Glass Saint, to protect him. At that moment he had arrived in front of Emperor Xia's palace and was looking up at it. He was a bit uneasy. Was this really Ren Huang's palace? It was so impressive and dignified, truly supernatural. He stepped forward to the foot of the palace. Cultivators were guarding the gate, And when they saw Yi Futian and the village chief, several of them stepped forward and blocked the path. "Who are you?" asked a guard. Yi Futian took a deep breath and said, "Yi Futian, palace lord of the Holy Ji Palace in the Barren State, and a vassal of Emperor Xia. I've come to seek an audience with Princess Xia Qing'an." The guard stared at him. There was no doubt that this was indeed Yi Futian. Who would dare stand in front of Emperor Xia's palace and tell lies? That would be looking for death. "Let me report to my superior," said one of the guards. "All right," Yi Futian nodded. He stood there in front of the gate, quietly waiting. Emperor Xia's palace was so strict that even small matters needed to be reported from the lowest levels to the highest, all throughout the palace. Yi Futian was a little anxious, but he kept his eyes fixed ahead of him. After a while, a maid came out. She looked at Yi Futian extremely coldly and said, "You are Yi Futian?" "Yes," Yi Futian nodded. "The princess says that she is not receiving guests today, and has asked me to personally see you off," said the maid. "Oh." Chapter 10:20. Yi Futian frowned. Xia Qingyuan intended to tell him the news, yet she kept him outside the door. It was apparently to settle the score of him behaving disrespectfully to her at the Holy Ji Palace that day. Yi Futian frowned. Xia Qingyuan intended to tell him the news, yet she kept him outside the door. It was apparently to settle the score of him behaving disrespectfully to her at the Holy Ji Palace that day. Xia Qingyuan crashed into his bedchambers, and it irked him as such. He behaved glumly to the princess back then. Yi Futian reminded himself of Jieyu and said to the servant girl, "Please inform the princess that I, Yi Futian, would be willing to come to her place to apologize for any disrespect I caused in the past." The princess said she is not seeing anyone and that is final. "Please come again, Palace Lord Yi." The servant girl's attitude did not change one bit and replied. Yi Futian looked at that servant girl and his silver hair billowed in the wind. His pointed eyes came to bear a tinge of coldness in them. That servant girl sensed the coldness emanating from his and averted her eyes, not daring to look at them anymore. He turned and looked at the tall palace tower and felt rather cold inside. If Xia Qingyuan were to take revenge on him with other matters, he would not have been bothered, but playing him using news regarding Jieyu was another matter altogether, and one could have imagined what he was going through. "Please inform the princess that I shall come again tomorrow," Yi Futian said to the servant girl, then turned around to address the village chief. "Let's go." There was nothing he could have done about Xia Qingyuan's antics. That place was Emperor Xia's palace after all. It was not just him. Anyone who came from Emperor Xia's realm would have had to lower their heads at such a place. No one dared to get nasty there after all. "Bring him up here." A voice was heard from high above, which sounded rather fleeting. Yi Futian stopped dead in his tracks before turning around. He then saw the servant girl said to him, "Come with me." Yi Futian stepped forward and passed the Heaven's Gate, heading into the Heavenly Palace. The village chief stayed waiting outside. Emperor Xia's palace was not a place that would have allowed entry with permission, and that applied to even the saints. Xia Qingyuan had only asked for Yi Futian to be brought in after all. Yi Futian went upwards for the heavenly tower, coming before a mesmerizing palace with clouds everywhere, looking immensely beautiful. The place was immensely thick with spiritual qi, making it seem as if it was indeed a fairyland. They stepped past a fairy bridge and came before a lotus pond. The silhouette of a man appeared there, yet when said silhouette turned around, the face of said figure was an extremely beautiful one. "Yi Futian greets the princess." Yi Futian bowed and said. Xia Qingyuan simply looked at him coldly without saying anything. "You insist on maintaining such aloof attitude despite having favors to ask from others?" Xia Qingyuan looked at Yi Futian. She was unable to sense one bit of sincerity from him. "There is no way I dare to behave in an aloof manner before you, princess. What happened in the Holy Ji Palace in the past was all my fault, for not receiving you in a proper manner. I hereby sincerely apologize, and I hope you would not be holding a grudge against me," Yi Futian said with a low voice. "Such pretense indeed," Xia Qingyuan said coldly. Yi Futian looked at her and struggled to keep his emotions in check. Xia Qingyuan knew what was going through his mind just by looking at his expression. She then said coldly, I've witnessed that battle of the Sacred War 3 years ago in the Holy Ji Palace. Hua Jieyu was apparently using external forces to invoke her powers. I looked into the places where they have studied and deliberately afterwards, finding a ruins with a supreme being in it. Her methods of training was also very exceptional. Yi Futian listened intently and felt rather tense. He then asked, "May I know what was so special about said method of training? You're here in the upper worlds to train now. Do you know how many realms are there here?" Xia Qingyuan asked. "I do not." Yi Futian shook his head. "There are 3,000 realms of the Great Path." Xia Qingyuan looked at Yi Futian. "So I brought people of both lower and upper worlds of Emperor Xia's realm to train outside. Although we've been to a myriad of places, the places that we've been to were only a handful in comparison." If it had been other days, Yi Futian might have been astounded by what he heard. However, at present, there was little more than a flutter in his mind, which disappeared as quickly it came. He then asked, "What does that have to do with my wife?" That ruins was left behind by one of the top-notch figures of the 3,000 realms. One thought connecting the divine and the 3,000 realms could have been reached. Your wife's soul remained intact, and it was possible that she was taken away by that supreme being. If that turned out to be the case, then there was a chance that she might have survived, Xia Qingyuan replied. Yi Futian's heart raced. He had already given in to despair. Despite Hua Qingqing's words before she left, he still found that unbelievable. He had witnessed Jieyu disintegrating right in his arms back then after all. Her body disintegrated and her soul took flight into the heavens. Even if her soul had stayed intact at that moment, there was no way she could have stayed alive. As such, he did not have much hope before he came. However, upon hearing what Xia Qingyuan said, a flame of hope lit up within his mind. 3,000 worlds of the Great Path. One thought connecting the divine could reach the 3,000 realms. If there was such massive forces existing in the world, then there was little else that was deemed impossible. The possibility of Jieyu's soul being brought away was very, very real. An intense heat welled up within his mind at the thought of that. He had been despaired for 3 years and his hope was reignited. One could have only imagined what was going on in his mind at the moment. "Princess, may I know who that top-notch figure might be?" Yi Futian asked. "It was too far away from you. You won't be able to look for her even if that is what you intend to do right now. Remain diligent in your training and get to St. Plain before you consider anything else." Xia Qingyuan did not tell Yi Futian. Yi Futian stared at her and she replied coldly, "What I've told are nothing but the truth. It is up to you if you want to believe me. I would say no more about anything else." She then turned around to face the pond and paying no heed to Yi Futian. Seeing how she carried herself, Yi Futian knew that he would not have been able to get further answers. He bowed to her back and said sincerely, "Thank you, Princess, for telling me all that. I'd be taking my leave." Yi Futian turned around and left after that. A silhouette appeared beside Xia Qingyuan without making a sound. It was none other than Emperor Xia himself. Xia Qingyuan eyed Emperor Xia and said, "You know that Queen's method of training was special, father. It is possible that there are countless throughout the 3,000 realms acquiring her lineage. She was but training using the powers of that queen. Even if the queen had been capable of saving Hua Jieyu, the chance of her doing so would have been infinitely minuscule. Why do you tell me this and give him hope, father? Wouldn't it be rather cruel if said hope bursts one day? Are you pitying him then?" Emperor Xia smiled and said to Xia Qingyuan. Xia Qingyuan's eyes remained composed and simply looked at her father. Emperor Xia knew her daughter's personality well and simply smiled, saying, "That guy is intensely sentimental. Having his hand ended up bleached due to emotional trauma and all that. In that case, it would seem that emotions serve as good driving force to further his training without a doubt. Telling him this would prompt him to train more diligently. Do you believe that? If the day comes where his hope proves to be little more than a bubble, wouldn't it have been a greater blow to his mind?" Xia Qingyuan asked. If such a day truly comes, his state of mind would be even more strengthened. He isn't someone so easily crushed. Don't underestimate him and don't forget, he has beaten you once, Emperor Xia smiled and said. The supreme ruler of Emperor Xia realm would have only been so tender when talking to his beloved daughter. Do you find that he has quite a nasty temper? Emperor Xia smiled and asked his daughter. Xia Qingyuan did not respond. Emperor Xia looked at his daughter and naturally knew how proud her daughter was as a person. Be it status or talents, she was peerless in all of Emperor Xia's realm. Anyone that she would have spoken to in such a soft-spoken manner was probably someone who had beaten her. If it had been someone else, she might have been able to scare them until the legs give with just one look. What is his actually? Xia Qingyuan asked curiously. She only knew that when his father was looking into Futian, a mysterious figure visited Emperor Xia's palace one day. The lockdown was lifted afterwards and her father summoned all of the saints below to the upper worlds, decreeing that the news regarding the sacred war shall not be leaked. Shadow guards were sent to the lower worlds and kept watch over all who had participated in that battle. She had never seen his father being concerned over anything since she began to remember things. I'd like to know as well. Emperor Xia stroked her head, looking doting and tender. The coming of the mysterious figure that day, coupled with everything he found about him, made her deduce that Futian's background held earth-shattering secrets. Secrets that were utterly terrifying. Xia Qingyuan glared at her father rather furiously for patting her head like that. Emperor Xia laughed and continued patting after seeing her expression. If someone outside were to witness the exchange, they would have definitely been astounded. Rumor had it that Emperor Xia was extremely doting to his little princess, and the truth was more real than what was speculated. But regardless of who he is, he ends up irking you nonetheless. How about I give an order and have him serve you and listen to your every order? Emperor Xia chuckled and continued, I'd like to see if that guy dare refuse. Xia Qingyuan recalled the time she had invited Futian and had been rejected all the same. She came to find that proposal rather tempting, but upon recalling that putrid face of his, she refused altogether. No need for that. All right, if you come to need it done, then just let me know, Emperor Xia said with a smile before disappearing from the spot. The people from the Holy Ji Palace arrived at an inn and everyone gathered. The three swordsmen Yi Wuchen, Su Ke, Zui Qianqiu walked together. The three of them had been training together all the time back in the Holy Ji Palace and they were very friendly with each other. The upper worlds are very bustling indeed. I'm guessing that there's really good booze around, Zui Qianqiu mumbled. He intended to take his time and take a good look of the upper worlds. Booze is boring. The girls on the upper worlds on the other hand, boy beauties are everywhere. Su Ke at the side narrowed his eyes and saw a female cultivator not far away, looking rather stunning. People of the upper worlds were commonly of high training, so their bearing were all exceptional and it was a given that they all looked stunning. Yi Wuchen had long gotten used to the antics of both of them and did not pay any heed. Zui Qianqiu really loved booze more than anything, yet Su Ke was just all talk. Su Ke stopped at that moment. Then both Yi Wuchen and Zui Qianqiu followed suit as they sensed something. Su Ke hailed from Tingxua House, so his senses were the sharpest of the three. He sensed killing intent headed for them. A group of people rode swords and came at them, dropping before them in an instant. All of them emanated startling sword will. It was apparent that they were all pure practitioners of the sword. They looked at Yi Wuchen and the other two with very, very cold eyes. Do you people have business with us? Su Ke narrowed his eyes as he looked at the group. They have not been arriving at the upper worlds for long, so there was no way they would have offended anyone. Unless old scores to settle. All of those people were swordsmen, and the three of them have indeed had scores to settle with swordsmen. Chapter 1021. A group of swordsmen dropped from above, attracting the attention of people around them. There were people gasped in surprise seeing the garb the swordsmen wore. A group of swordsmen dropped from above, attracting the attention of people around them. There were people gasped in surprise seeing the garb the swordsmen wore. Swordsmen of Lihan Heaven. The number one holy land of the sword in Emperor Xia's realm would have attracted attention wherever their people went. There were people gushing in from other places seeing the group of swordsmen from Lihan Heaven descending. Everyone looked in their direction. Those people then eyed Yi Wuqian and the other two beside him. Who are those three cultivators? Lu Cheng of Lihan Heaven. Someone recognized the leader of the group of swordsmen and they shuddered. Who are the hell are those three? Getting not only the swordsmen of Lihan Heaven to mobilize, but even Lu Cheng, who ranked 9th on the Jotian ranking as well. Lu Cheng had tested his mettle in the Jotian temple, being ranked on the Jotian ranking. It was said that he was already at the pinnacle of Sage Plane, and was one step away from becoming a saint. Anyone who had seen him fight in the Jotian temple was able to recognize him right away. It seemed other than Lu Cheng. None of the swordsmen from Lihan Heaven right before them were weak people as well. But then again, someone who trained in the number 1 Holy Land of the Sword in Emperor's Realm would not have been anything less than a rare genius to begin with. Lihan Heaven. All three of them knew what was going on immediately. It was said that Pei Qianying, the cultivator whom Yi Futian had crippled in the Jotian temple back then, was a cultivator from Lihan Heaven. Those people were from the number 1 Holy Land of the Sword in Emperor Xia's realm, and all three of them stepped onto the upper worlds. It could have been said they were stepping into the turf of others. The upper worlds were not a part of the 9 states. Let's go, Suke said lightly, and all three of them retreated like bolts of lightning. It was not a good thing to run into people from one such holy land as soon as they have gotten to the upper worlds. Regardless if they ended up winning or losing the fight, things would have turned out really messy. They, cultivators of the Holy Ji Palace, were fresh off the boat there, and so none of them wanted to make any trouble for the Holy Ji Palace. But then again, that was their wish and the other party might not have shared their intentions. The cultivators of Lihan Heaven turned into swords immediately and blocked their way. All of them were capable of moving at extreme speeds. Formless sword will filled the air and reached the three of them, making them feel extremely unwell, and their spiritual will seemed pained. Lu Cheng turned his eyes at the three of them. He looked composed as he said, "The three of them are sages. Will play by the rules of the Jotian temple of old, challenging you three as fellow sages." It was an order from their teacher. As such, Lihan Heaven did not field a saint. They needed to win according to the rules which they lost to back then. It was the pride of theirs as cultivators of the number 1 Holy Land of the Sword in Emperor Xia's realm. While they knew that the ones freshly arrived at the upper worlds had saints among them, but the people of Lihan Heaven were not concerned about them making a move. Lihan Heaven was the one calling the shots in Emperor Xia's realm in that regard. Anyone dared field a saint to take on their sages might as well be digging their own graves. Yi Wuqian, Suke and Zui Qianqiu all burst with stunning sword will. Terrifying sword aura storms whipped up around them. If they were unable to leave, then they might as well fight. Cripple them, and leave the one-armed swordsman's life spirit behind. Lu Cheng's voice was a cold one. Pei Qianying was his younger brother in training. While they hardly talked to each other and the relationship was more like that of an acquaintance, but they hailed from the same holy land nonetheless. The score of him having his life spirit crushed was something that had to be settled the hard way. Get out as soon as possible, don't linger, Suke said to Yi Wuqian and Zui Qianqiu telepathically after sensing the powerful sword will around them. While all of the combatants present were sages, but their enemies consisted mostly of those at the pinnacle of Sage Plane, which differed considerably from the three. They were not dealing with the geniuses of the 9 states at the moment, but the top-notch swordsmen from Lihan Heaven of the upper worlds. As such, it was immensely difficult to fight with such a visible plane difference. It was especially so that all three of them were isolated from the entire group. A swordsman from Lihan Heaven stepped forward in the air and light of flame seemed to glow from his clothes. His body became intensely hot like the sun. Divine fires of the sun shone from above and terrifying sword aura whipped around. In an instant, a sword of rules coalesced. That sword seemed to have been forged by the fires of the sun, burning with glittering light of flames, and it seemed that the space around it burned as well. Chu Qingyang, the glaring sun flames. Many in the crowd who watched from far away reminded of a swordsman from Lihan Heaven, as they looked at the handsome face of that one who attacked. It was a genius swordsman who went by the name Chu Qingyang. Who are the Lihan Heaven dealing with this time? They were wondering who those three are for prompting the Holy Land to field such a lineup. Why is Lu Cheng mentioning about the rules of the Jotian Temple? Another one from the left struck. That figure was armed with a thin sword. which was as thin as the wings of cicadas. The sword seemed to be devoid of weight altogether. The wielder seemed to be moving with the patterns of the rules of wind, emanating a flighty aura. Li Qiufeng, the autumn wind sword. The one who spoke before spoke again, seemingly very familiar with the swordsmen of Lihan Heaven, so much so that they seemed to recognize them simply by observing how they wielded their blades. The third person attacked, and he was different from the first two. He wielded a heavy blade which had no edge, looking like something that was incapable of cutting at all. He was tall and exuded power. He did not look like a swordsman, yet no one dared to take him lightly. There were no weaklings among the swordsmen of Lihan Heaven. It was especially so in the case of Wang Mang, the overbearing sword. The three of them formed a triangle and stood high in the air, taking on the three below. Their aura was overpowering, and the other swordsmen spread out, standing around to prevent the three from escaping. Everyone who saw that realized that that was the end for the three of them. Anyone that Lihan Heaven intended to cripple had no way of escaping, especially so when assaulted by such a lineup. It was apparent that Lihan Heaven had intentions of letting their prey escape. Boom! A stifling pressure swept the place, and many felt as if a huge pressure had coiled around their chests. Those power of rules alone was enough to make a lot feeling they were about to suffocate. Wang Mang, the overbearing sword, struck first. He stepped forward and held his sword with both hands, striking down hard from above. A stifling rumble was heard in an instant, as if the air had been split open. Boundless might of the heavy sword was brought down. A terrifying storm whipped about in the air, pressing onto the three of them. They looked up in the air and felt countless heavy swords raining down on them, as if slivers of souls of swords pierced the air and pinned their spiritual will down, intending to shatter them into pieces. The three of them felt immense pressure on them within an instant, so much so that they seemed to have trouble even walking. The ground beneath them continued to crack, and the cracks spread out, as if intending to create a crater right there and then. The powerful ones far away all sensed the stifling pressure, and they continued to retreat. Yi Wuxian, Zui Qianqiu, and Su Ke were at the center of the storm. Their sword aura coalesced into a river and shot up at the heavy sword. While all of them were at archmage plane, they still paled in comparison to their opponents, as they were at upper level of said plane. If it had not been for having undergone the medicine baths that Saint Jiang had prepared for them for the past few years, that one strike would have injured all three of them. Lihan Heaven's rules of the sword were capable of targeting mental powers. Chu Qingyang, the glaring sun flames struck, shooting down the light of the sun with just one stroke from above. A beam of sunlight packing intense heat shone on them. They felt as if the intense heat was about to tear their spiritual will powers apart before the sword was even about to reach them. Wang Mang, Chu Qingyang, and Li Qiufeng were all at the pinnacle of sage plane after all. While the Lihan Heaven swordsmen were arrogant, they dared not underestimate their opponents nonetheless. The group of sages sent after the people of the one who claimed to be peerless in all of the 9 states, and had actually beaten the Zhoutian temple, would have definitely been extremely powerful. Any one of them would have been ranked at the forefront of the sage ranking, if they were to be cultivators of the 9 states of the lower worlds. Li Qiufeng struck as well. A storm seemed to have whipped as soon as he drew his sword, hitting all three of them. Thousands of currents conjured by the sword were fearsome enough that every single current would have been able to cut down sages at the pinnacle of the plane. When all three of them lashed out, many sent their condolences to the ones at the receiving end silently. It was extremely difficult for anyone below Saint Plane to withstand such attacks. Even sages at the pinnacle of their training would have had a hard time, especially when the ones taking the attacks were sages who had yet to reach upper level of archmage plane. It seemed to have sufficed with each lashing out with one strike. Yi Wuxian, Zui Qianqiu, and Su Ke were caught in the middle of the storm. Brilliant light burst from Yi Wuxian's body. The sword will coursing about his body seemed to have mystical powers and felt excessively overbearing. A silver sword shot out from the center of his brow. That sword spirit burst with dazzling glitter. Thousands of sword will raged and set out to tear everything apart. The attacks that were hammering on the spiritual will on all three of them were torn to shreds. The silver sword rang and terrifying storm of sword aura was conjured. A huge sword was materialized with the silver sword at the center. Brilliant golden light surrounded the giant sword. The two mystical beams crossed and looked incredibly dazzling. Break! Yi Wuqian looked up and a beam of ferocious sword will shot from his eyes. He pointed at the air with a finger and the giant sword unleashed towering sword aura, shredding the might of the sword, pinning them. All sword wills were torn to shreds within an instant. Ren Huang's sword will. Lu Cheng took a look at Yi Wuqian. His younger brother in training has had a scuffle with that man over that Ren Huang sword will, attempting to strip his life spirit to refine the Ren Huang sword will. However, Pei Qianying was crippled before he was able to finish. Yi Wuqian, at present, seemed to have infused the Ren Huang sword will within his life spirit, enabling him to borrow the might of the Ren Huang sword will. The three who were attacking sensed it as well. They did not spend more than mere moments being stunned and quickly struck yet again. Wang Meng, the overbearing sword, conjured a sword mudra, and the might of the overbearing sword grew even more terrifying. Boundless golden swords appeared above all three of them. Every single sword was branded with glittering patterns, enabling all of them to burst with greater might. Cut! Wang Meng shouted coldly. The overbearing swords zipped down like bolts of lightning in an instant, dropping down onto the heads of the three below from above. Terrifying storms whipped up around Yi Wuqian. The Ren Huang sword will was infused with his life spirit and countless swords appeared as well, shooting above and clashing with the sword aura that was raining down. The giant sword that was conjured by his life spirit clashed with the overbearing sword and frightening storms resulted. The overbearing sword shuddered and the patterns on it cracked and crumbled bit by bit. The sword eventually shattered as the cracks grew. Run! A single word was heard from Yi Wuqian. He shot up like a bolt of lightning. The sword spirit was even quicker than he was, heading straight for Wang Meng. Chapter 1022. Wang Meng saw Yi Wuqian attacking, his eyes sharp and imperious, and he stepped into the void, and a terrifying force of suppression rules swept out. Wang Meng saw Yi Wuqian attacking, his eyes sharp and imperious, and he stepped into the void, and a terrifying force of suppression rules swept out. Behind him the life spirit bloomed instantly, and it was a giant golden overbearing sword. He held the sword of spirit and slammed it down from the sky, endless golden brilliance blooming while the overbearing sword slashed across the sky, killing everything below as its power was overwhelming. The brow chakra of Yi Wuqian lit up, and a beautiful and brilliant light shone out, connected with the sword of spirit, and it gave out an illusion between heaven and earth in an instant. At this moment Wang Meng only saw a sky full of swords and was unable to detect where he was. There was only an infinite sword sweeping over and competing with his. Others were not idle either. The speed of the battle of swordsmen was unimaginably fast. The forces of attack were extremely strong, and fast as lightning. The flaming sword of Chu Qingyang burned in the void. He stepped forward wanting to attack, but he saw a gray afterimage came toward him. A dark air current appeared in the void, and Su Ke melted within the darkness, going for Chu Qingyang at an incredibly fast speed. The darkness ate away the flaming light bit by bit. Chu Qingyang lifted up his sword, the light of the sun shooting down and resonating with the sword. The light burned up everything, and terrible rays of the flaming sword light penetrated the darkness, piercing it. All the darkness seemed to be revealed under the flame. Su Ke's figure appeared, and in his hand, he seemed to be holding a very thin sword like a needle. When Su was moving it was hard to see that there was any weapon in his hand, but it was a divine implement left over by the 9 cultivators sent by Li Yao when they were slain. Su Ke possessed one of them. Zui Qianqiu also had the same divine implement, and at this time he rushed toward Li Qiufeng. Both of their speeds were ghostly. All anyone could see was 2 shadowy images in the storm. The attack of the 6 swordsmen unleashed almost at the same instant. Yi Wuqian seemed to have opened his third eye, and his one arm stretched out, pointing to the void empty, and he spat out one word, open. The moment when his voice faded, the sword will of that upward motion was swallowed by the sword of spirit and turned into one sword, and there appeared a little dot above the void, as if one sword had opened up the sky. In this moment the endless golden and giant sword that was falling down was shattered into nothingness, and the light slayed toward Wang Meng. As if detecting the danger, Wang Mang roared and a terrible sword armor appeared and surrounded his body, while the overbearing sword returned to its place and was held in his hands. Boom! When the sword arrived, the life spirit of the overbearing sword seemed to have cracked, and the sword will pierced through it. With a sound, Wang Mang's body was propelled to the distant sky. He spat out a mouthful of blood, his face instantly turning pale. Yi Wuchen glanced at the direction of Su Ke and Zui Qianqiu. The body suspended in the air. The sword spirit floated in front of him, humming and blooming endless air currents of sword wei, rolled toward the vast battlefield. In this instant, all the will of heaven turned into swords while Chu Qingyang and Li Qiufeng were occupying the absolute advantage. They suddenly felt a great sense of danger, and then they saw the hand of Yi Wuchen placed before the sword spirit, and a storm of destruction appeared in this void. At this time, Lu Cheng also looked up and swiped a glance at Yi Wuchen. He knew that Yi Wuchen was madly urging the Renhuang sword will, obviously having had some comprehension regarding the Renhuang sword will, and could borrow from it to explode shocking power, injuring Wang Mang. Moreover, there was still some strength left over from it, but upon observing the sword he understood that Yi Wuchen could not have urged such a sword once or twice without exhausting his own spiritual willpower. This was him forcing the Renhuang sword will, at a great cost to his own detriment. Yi Wuchen's eyes were demonic, an endless sword will flowed between the heaven and the earth. His finger pressed once again, and in a flash a sword came instantly, locked onto Chu Qingyang for the kill. Chu Qingyang's body retreated explosively, and a sword crossed the sky and cut off the flame. The sword light whizzed past and cut off the sword in his hand and caused his body to back off wildly. Afterward, another radiant arc crossed and arced toward Li Qiufeng. Li Qiufeng's speed was fast to the limit, like a gust of wind that was retreating. His afterimages filled the space between heaven and earth. A radiant light now beamed between Yi Wuchen's brows, connected with the sword, so that the sword of spirit reached equally fast speed. In the void, man and sword chased one another and created lines and lines of curvature. Boom! With a loud sound, the storm was cleaved through, and Li Qiufeng spat out a mouthful of blood. His body was injured by the piercing sword will, and he was covered in blood. Buzz! The sword returned, suspended in front of Yi Wuchen's brow chakra, humming. However, the sword will between the heaven and the earth had weakened much. Obviously, after 2 moves of the sword, it was difficult for Yi Wuchen to sustain the power he had previously. Lu Cheng cast a glance at Yi Wuchen and said nonchalantly, "Not bad for Renhuang sword will. Even if when borrowed by a sage it can have such power. Block this." When his voice fell, he stepped out. For a moment the sword chi swayed, and above the firmament, there was an immense sword will attempting to slam down from the void. 3,000-mile sword. The hearts of the people in the distance trembled. The sword of Lu Cheng was the true inheritance of his master. A sword in which its sword will could traverse 3,000 miles. Lihan Heaven was the premier holy land for sword wei. In addition to Swordmaster of Lihan, who had long stopped involving himself with the matters of the world, there were several other sword saint-level characters whose cultivations were extremely terrifying. Lu Cheng and the others were the disciples of a sword saint, and he was also the one who taught Pei Qianying at Lihan Heaven. When Lu Cheng stepped out, there seemed to be a sword falling down from the sky. A sword condensed over his head, and the endless airflow of sword wei now whistled into the sword. Lu Cheng's palm made a grabbing motion in the void, and the sword was out, ditches forming in the sky, and with his body as the center, the 3,000-mile sword seemed to be obliterating everything in front of him. Suddenly the big handprints of Buddha slapped out at the same time, toward the sword marks that were coming down. Fierce bursts of sound came out, the sword marks were destroyed madly, and the palm prints were also splitting and breaking apart. Yu Sheng stabilized his body and covered the other 3 people by his own body. The sword will continued to blast onto his body, but was not able to break his dark gold armor. A number of people rushed into the battlefield, and Huang Zhouge also arrived. Bang! Yu Sheng took a step in the void and went to Lu Cheng, who was in front. At this moment Lu Cheng could feel an immense and strong pressure from the other. The power of this person was terrifying. Another loud sound, and Yusheng continued to step forward. Each step made the world tremble. Lu Cheng frowned. Today, everyone who came from Lihan Heaven were its most powerful swordsmen, fully prepared to face Yi Futian and his cohort. Now before Yi Futian had even made an appearance, he had felt the pressure already. With sword in hand, the sword chi coursing, Lu Cheng's body leapt forward, and the infinite airflow of the way of the sword roared wildly, forming a force with the sword. Chop! Lu Cheng's body descended from the sky, and the sword slashed out, crossing a great distance, and sword marks where they have cut through the void, like the most terrible storm of destruction, slashing toward Yusheng's body. But Yusheng stepping into the sky, the dark golden light of the Buddha demon shined upon his body, and many people look at him moving forward in shock. Did he not care for his life? The terrible sword chi slammed down and blasted on his immense and wild body, colliding with his defense, but was not able to breach it. The Buddha and the demon now as one, but also both. Under his body that ran wildly, the sword marks were bursting and exploding madly. Later, everyone saw a huge fist rushing down with might force of the sky, and the space seemed to suffocate under its strike. Lu Cheng's sword once again slashed out, but before the sword chi could fully explode, the huge fist smashed on his sword, and the sound of destruction was heard. The sword exploded and pulverized, and Lu Cheng's body quickly withdrew like a sword, but the fist still fell on him and a terrifying force blasted on him through the space. Lu Cheng's body was blasted toward the distance, and all the bones of his body made a clear cracking sound of explosion. Chapter 1023. At the moment when Lu Cheng was knocked away, the hearts of everyone present also jumped. That strike was too fierce, and how could it be resisted by mere flesh and blood? At the moment when Lu Cheng was knocked away, the hearts of everyone present also jumped. That strike was too fierce, and how could it be resisted by mere flesh and blood? This strike probably cost half of Lu Cheng's life force. The people who were observing the battle in the distance revealed a look of horror. This time the premier Holy Land of Sword Wei in Emperor Xiao's realm sent out such an impressive group to deal with several sages, and originally everyone thought the other party would definitely be at a disadvantage, but they never would have thought that following Yi Wuchen's explosive actions, Yusheng descended like a demon god, so that even someone as strong as Lu Cheng was crushed. I have seen him a few years ago at the Jiuqian temple. His name was still on the list of the Jiuqian ranking, but at that time he only challenged at the Magi plane. Some people exclaimed, shocked, and seeming to recall the haughtiness postures of the three. He continued, he came from 9 states. The 3 great cultivators who made a short-lived appearance a few years ago? Many people had heard of the Battle of the Jiuqian Temple. At the time it had caused some sensation in the upper worlds. After all, 3 people from the 9 states broke through the 9th layer of heaven at the same time, and with Princess Xia Qingyuan attended the battle in person. Yes, this person was one of them, that person said, and suddenly many people trembled in their hearts, and they understood why Lihan Heaven had dispatched such delegates to face them. Those who had conquered the Jiuqian temple would not likely be overcome by ordinary characters. As for the reason of their appearance, it couldn't be more clear. When Lihan Heaven disciple Pei Qianying was disabled at the Jiuqian temple, it was in front of several other disciples from Lihan Heaven. Although it was Pei Qianying who had instigated the grievance with the other party, and had challenged them at 9th layer of heaven, he was, after all, a disciple of Lihan Heaven, and these disciples seemed to want to avenge him, so it was little wonder that Lu Cheng declared that he wanted to disable these 3 individuals. But perhaps he had never thought that those people who had conquered the Jiuqian temple, after these few years, were strong enough to crush someone as strong as he. Many in the upper worlds, like the cultivators of Lihan Heaven, had heard about the battle a few years back. Though they knew those 3 were powerful, they had no actual idea just how powerful they were. Today, however, they were seeing one of them. Compared to the rumors of a few years ago, he was only stronger than imagined, not weaker. Boom! Yusheng took a great step and continued to move toward the fallen figure. He was surrounded by a terrifying, overbearing pressure. His demon godlike presence was giving out a suffocating pressure. Yi Futian led cultivators of St. Plain to the upper worlds was because of what happened at that time. But as soon as they have arrived, that trouble already was at their door suggested that someone was keeping tabs on them. Of course, Yu Sheng knew exactly what that meant. Otherwise, it would be impossible for them to come so quickly. When the disciples of Lihan Heaven saw Yu Sheng's movements, they all came to Lu Cheng's side, and the sword will flowed around their bodies. A sword net seemed to have appeared in this space, the sword will of Lihan permeating every corner. Boom! A loud bang. Buddha and demon of all heavens appeared behind Yu Sheng. The Buddha and the demon as one, its authority pressuring the world. Their palms struck forward at the same time, and the magnificent body of Yu Sheng also struck out like the Mahavarakana, but it was the palm of Mahavarakana with demonic attribute, blasting forward toward those cultivators. The swordsmen of Lihan Heaven swung their swords at the same time, and suddenly all the palm prints were torn and shattered. Yu Sheng stepped forward in great strides and the ground shook. The swords of the swordsmen pointed at Yu Sheng, intent to kill. All swords became one and stabbed on Yu Sheng's torso. The body that was covered by the dark golden armor seemed to be indestructible, but even so, the armor was disintegrated bit by that sword will of Lihan, and it was even slicing at the spiritual will, rushing into the mind of Yu Sheng. If it was another person, their body would probably be immediately separated into a million pieces. However, the body of Yu Sheng was already exceeding normal physical limit. After the sacred war, he was also tempered by St. Zhang's medicinal bath, so that the strength of his body was only below the saints, and not something that could be surpassed by mere numbers of combatants. Because after all, even a large number of people was not an indication of the increased combat power of an individual, and without a strong enough offensive, they would never be able to overcome the defense, so a large number of people was simply useless. The increase in the battlefield matrix that would increase the damages of the single attack was perhaps a little more hopeful. Roar! A loud holler came out, the lion's roar shaking the sky, ringing through the eardrums of the people. The swordsmen from Lihan Heaven felt that their heads were about to burst, and then Yu Sheng threw a punch and the void seemed to be exploding, and many figures were knocked away. Even the strong swordsman from Lihan Heaven could not block him. What strength was this? Boom! Another step, Yu Sheng continued to move forward, and ran straight toward Lu Cheng, who had already stood up, and the sword that Lu Cheng had used to smash at Wuxian, showing its intent to kill. Seeing that body like a demon god coming toward him, Lu Cheng's heart beating wildly, and his entire body was surrounded by shining and radiant sword light. His life spirit bloomed. From the sky there appeared a giant sword, and he felt an acute sense of fatal danger. Obviously, Lu Cheng never thought that anyone from the 9 states could be as strong as this. Upon Yu Sheng, the light of the Buddha and demon was blazing, and when he saw the faint divine authority above Lu Cheng, and divine implement had been shown, he did not hesitate to take out the battle axe of judgment and smash it toward Lu Cheng. Slice! Lu Cheng put both hands above the top of his head, waving forward, and suddenly a giant sword from the top of his head smashed out, cutting a thick and incomparable sword mark in the sky, like a natural fissure cutting through the void, piercing through the sky. The battle axe of judgment slammed down, and suddenly the sword mark exploded and was destroyed. The swordway continued to collapse and self-destruct, and Yu Sheng leveraged its momentum to smash toward Lu Cheng. With a loud boom, the battle axe of judgment smashed on the divine sword, crushing Lu Cheng's body. He let out an angry roar, still holding on, and the sword Qi soared. The Buddha and demon of all heavens appeared, and their power pressed the sky, and broke the sword Qi once again. Lu Cheng's knees slammed into the ground, and there was a loud bang. Terrible cracks appeared on the ground, which extended toward the 4 sides. Enough! A loud commanding sound came from the sky, and there was an authority of the divine path falling down, rocking the firmament. The heart of many jumped, and when they looked up at the sky, they saw the clouds and wind moving, and there was an invisible pressure of the divine path that flowed above the sky, feeling extremely sharp. This air current pressed toward Yu Sheng and asked him to stop. Yu Sheng looked up at the void, his look indifferent, and the battle axe of judgment continued its downward movement. The blood continued to come out of Lu Cheng's mouth, his body collapsing, and all the innards were rocked to their limit, and he felt on the verge of destruction. How dare you! A cold reprimand came out, the wind above the sky blowing, and immense sword will started to gather. The next loud sound of rumbling was heard. A sword came from outside the sky, and cracks appeared in the void. A sword that passed 3,000 miles, carrying the momentum of the thunder toward Yushang. The heaven and the earth seemed to be annihilated by this one blow. In the distance, everyone was madly retreating, fearing that they would be caught in the peripheral of the attack. But obviously they worried overmuch. The opponent's control over the sword was superb, and it was meant only for Yushang, and not the rest of the swordsmen of Lihan Heaven. Yushang looked up at the sword, and it came in an instant, forcing him to retract the battle-axe of judgment and smashed it toward the sword will in the void instead. This sword came from outside the sky, and when the sword fell, the space in which Yushang was in seemed to be pierced, the ground madly bursting and smashing, and that sturdy, godlike body crazily backing up. His shirt was torn, and a sword stabbed onto the battle-axe of judgment, puffing out endless horrific authority of the sword, madly tearing at his body. An angry roar, the terrible defense of Yushang was broken through by the sword chi, and blood flowed. His body flew out in reverse, and at that time the sword stopped, flying back to the void, and everywhere the sword had pointed to, its chi was felt for miles. Boom! A loud sound, and everyone saw that Yushang had fallen to the ground, covered in blood. The shocked crowd looked up to the sword, and the sword mark on the sky that ran 1,000 miles. 3,000-mile sword. They already knew who wielded the sword. Lihan Heaven Sword Saint Liang. Sword Saint of Liang, even in the upper worlds, was considered a big deal, and he was also Lu Cheng's master, cultivating in Lihan Heaven, whose actual strength was unfathomable. At this time there was a faint shadow gathering on the sword that was suspended in the sky. It was the shadow of Sword Saint of Liang, and it was also the person who Pei Qianying begged on the ground. Juing Sword Saint knew that he couldn't take care of the people from the Holy Ji Palace, so he took Pei Qianying to Lihan Heaven, intended to us Lihan Heaven's power for revenge. The Sword Saint of Liang understood perfectly the idea of Juing Sword Saint. But seeing his disciple kneeling and begging, and when he thought how he had been disabled, he still couldn't resist sending out the swordsmen of Lihan Heaven, to allow them to take Futian and his cohorts, following the rules of the Jiuqian Temple.